is in a special sense a manifestation of the second aspect of the solar deity, the second person of the blessed Trinity. Religion has an objective side to it. It acts not only from within by stirring up the hearts and minds of its votaries, but also from without by arranging that uplifting and refining influences shall play constantly upon their various vehicles. The temple or the church is meant to be not merely a place of worship, but also a center of magnetism, through which spiritual forces can be poured out upon the district surrounding it. People often forget that even the great ones must do their work subject to the laws of nature, and that it is for them an actual duty to economize their force as much as possible, and therefore to do whatever they have to do in the easiest possible manner. In this case, for example, if the object be to let spiritual force shine forth over a certain district, it would not be economical to pour it down indiscriminately everywhere, like rain. Since that would require that the miracle of its materialization to a lower level should be performed in millions of places simultaneously, once for every drop, as it were, and each representing a mighty effort. Far simpler would it be to establish at certain points definite magnetic centers, where the machinery of such materialization should be permanently set up, so that by pouring in only a little force from above it should instantly be spread abroad over a considerable area. This had been achieved in earlier religions by the establishment of strongly magnetized centers, such as are offered by the image or by the lingam in a Hindu temple, by the altar of the sacred fire among the Parsis, or by the statue of the Lord Buddha among the Buddhists. As each worshipper comes before one of these symbols and pours himself out in devotion or gratitude, he not only draws down the answering force upon himself, but also causes a certain radiation upon those for some distance round him. In founding the religion of Christianity, the Bodhisattva tried a new experiment with the view of securing at least once daily a much more thorough and effective distribution of spiritual force. The fact that new experiments of this sort may be tried, that though the splendid system of the hierarchy is unalterably founded upon the rock of ages, it yet permits so much of freedom to its officials, is surely of deepest interest. It shows us that that organization which is in all the world the most utterly conservative is yet at the same time amazingly liberal, and that the oldest form of government is also the most adaptable. It is only in reference to the august head of the hierarchy that we can use to the fullest extent those grand old words of a collect of the Church of England: in his service is perfect freedom. Perhaps the most readily comprehensible way of explaining this new scheme will be to describe the way in which I myself was first enabled to see something of the details of its working. But first I must say a few words as to the present condition of the Christian Church. As we see that Church now, it is but a poor representation of what its founder meant it to be. Originally it had its higher mysteries, like all other faiths, and its 3 stages of purification, illumination and perfection, through which its children had to pass. With the expulsion as heretics of the great Gnostic doctors, this aspect of the truth was lost to the Church, and the only idea which it now places before its members is the first of the 3 stages, and even that not understandingly. Origen, one of the greatest men that it has ever produced, described very clearly the 2 kinds of Christianity, the somatic or physical, and the spiritual, saying that the former is meant only to attract the ignorant masses, but that the latter is for those who know. In these days the Church has forgotten that true spiritual and higher side of her teaching, and has busied herself with pitiful attempts to explain that there is somehow or other a spiritual side to the lower teaching, which is practically all that she has left. Christian magic. Nevertheless, and in spite of all this, the old magic which was instituted by her founder is still working and effective, so even in these days of her decadence she is still definitely under guidance and control. There is still a real and a vital power in the sacraments when truly performed, the power of the solar deity himself, and it comes through him whom we call the Master Jesus, this being his special department. It was not he, but the Christ, the Lord Mithraea, who founded the religion, but nevertheless the special charge of Christianity has been given into the hands of him who yielded his body for the work of the founder. Belief in his personal interest in the Christian Church has almost died out in many branches of it. The members think of him as a teacher who lived 2,000 years ago rather than as an active power in the Church today. They have forgotten that he is still a living force, a real presence, truly with us always, even to the end of the world, as he has said. Not God in the idolatrous sense, yet the channel through which the divine power has reached many millions, the official in charge of the devotional department of the work of the Christ. The Church has turned aside widely from the course originally marked out for it. It was meant to meet all types, now it meets only one, and that very imperfectly. The reconstruction of the links must come, and as intellectual activity is the sign of our time and of the latest subrace. The intellectual revival which shows itself in the higher criticism has for its very purpose that of enabling religion to meet another type of mind. If only the priests and the teachers had the advantage of direct knowledge, they would be able to deal with and to help their people in this crisis, to guide their intellectual activity by means of their own knowledge of the truth. And to keep alive in the hearts of their flock the spirituality without which the intellectual effort can be but barren. Not only has the Church almost entirely forgotten the original doctrine taught by her founder, but most of her priests have now little conception of the real meaning and power of the ceremonies which they have to perform. It is probable that the Christ foresaw that this would happen, for he has carefully arranged that the ceremonies should work even though neither celebrants nor people have any intelligent comprehension of their methods or their results. It would be difficult to explain the outline of his plan to the average Christian. To the theosophist it ought to be more readily comprehensible, because he is already familiar with some of the general ideas involved in it. We who are students have often heard of the great reservoir of force which is constantly being filled by the Nirmanakas in order that its contents may be utilized by members of the adept hierarchy and their pupils for the helping of the evolution of mankind. The arrangement made by the Christ with regard to his religion was that a kind of special compartment of that reservoir should be reserved for its use, and that a certain set of officials should be empowered by the use of certain special ceremonies. Certain words and signs of power, to draw upon it for the spiritual benefit of their people. The scheme adopted for passing on the power is what is called ordination, and thus we see at once the real meaning of the doctrine of the apostolic succession, about which there has been so much of argument. I myself held strongly to that doctrine while officiating as a priest of the Church. But when through the study of theosophy I came to understand religion better and to take a far wider view of life, I began to doubt whether in reality the succession meant so much as we of the ritualistic party had supposed. With still further study however, I was rejoiced to find that there was a real foundation for the doctrine, and that it meant even much more than our highest schools had ever taught. The Mass. My attention was first called to this by watching the effect produced by the celebration of the Mass in a Roman Catholic church in a little village in Sicily. Those who know that most beautiful of islands will understand that one does not meet with the Roman Catholic Church there in its most intellectual form, and neither the priest nor the people could be described as especially highly developed. Yet the quite ordinary celebration of the Mass was a magnificent display of the application of occult force. At the moment of consecration the host glowed with the most dazzling brightness. It became in fact a veritable sun to the eye of the clairvoyant, and as the priest lifted it above the heads of the people I noticed that two distinct varieties of spiritual force poured forth from it, which might perhaps be taken as roughly corresponding to the light of the sun and the streamers of his corona. The first rayed out impartially in all directions upon all the people in the church, indeed, it penetrated the walls of the church as though they were not there, and influenced a considerable section of the surrounding country. This force was of the nature of a strong stimulus and, its action was strongest of all in the intuitional world, though it was also exceedingly powerful in the three higher subdivisions of the mental world. Its activity was marked in the first, second and third subdivisions of the astral also, but this was a reflection of the mental, or perhaps an effect produced by sympathetic vibration. Its effect upon the people who came within the range of its influence was proportionate to their development. In a very few cases, where there was some slight intuitional development, it acted as a powerful stimulant, doubling or trebling for a time the amount of activity in those intuitional bodies and the radiance which they were capable of emitting. But forasmuch as in most people the intuitional matter was as yet almost entirely dormant, its chief effect was produced upon the causal bodies of the inhabitants. Most of them, again, were awake and partially responsive only as far as the matter of the third subdivision of the mental world was concerned. And therefore they missed much of the advantage that they might have gained if the higher parts of their causal bodies had been in full activity. But at any rate every ego within reach, without exception, received a distinct impetus and a distinct benefit from that act of consecration, little though he knew or recked of what was being done. The astral vibrations also, though much fainter, produced a far-reaching effect, for at least the astral bodies of the Sicilians are usually thoroughly well developed so that it is not difficult to stir their emotions. Many people far away from the church, walking along the village street or pursuing their various avocations upon the lonely hillsides, felt for a moment a thrill of affection or devotion. As this great wave of spiritual peace and strength passed over the countryside, though assuredly they never dreamt of connecting it with the Mass which was being celebrated in their little cathedral. It at once becomes evident that we are here in the presence of a grand and far-reaching scheme. Clearly one of the great objects, perhaps the principal object, of the daily celebration of the Mass is that every one within reach of it shall receive at least once each day one of these electric shocks which are so well calculated to promote any growth of which he is capable. Such an outpouring of force brings to each person whatever he has made himself capable of receiving. But even the quite undeveloped and ignorant cannot but be somewhat the better for the passing touch of a noble emotion, while for the few more advanced it means a spiritual uplifting the value of which it would be difficult to exaggerate. I said that there was a second effect, which I compared to the streamers of the sun's corona. The light which I have just described poured forth impartially upon all, the just and the unjust, the believers and the scoffers. But this second force was called into activity only in response to a strong feeling of devotion on the part of an individual. At the elevation of the host all members of the congregation duly prostrated themselves, some apparently as a mere matter of habit, but some also with a strong upwelling of deep devotional feeling. The effect as seen by clairvoyant sight was most striking and profoundly impressive, for to each of these latter there darted from the uplifted host a ray of fire, which set the higher part of the astral body of the recipient glowing with the most intense ecstasy. Through the astral body, by reason of its close relation with it, the intuitional vehicle was also strongly affected. And although in none of these peasants could it be said to be in any way awakened, its growth within its shell was unquestionably distinctly stimulated, and its capability of instinctively influencing the astral was enhanced. For while the awakened intuition can consciously mold and direct the astral, there is a great storehouse of force in even the most undeveloped intuitional vehicle, and this shines out upon and through the astral body, even though it be unconsciously and automatically. I was naturally intensely interested in this phenomenon, and I made a point of attending various functions at different churches in order to learn whether what I had seen on this occasion was invariable, or, if it varied, when and under what conditions. I found that at every celebration the same results were produced, and the two forces which I have tried to describe were always in evidence, the first apparently without any appreciable variation, but the display of the second depending upon the number of really devotional people who formed part of the congregation. The elevation of the host immediately after its consecration was not the only occasion upon which this display of force took place. When the benediction was given with the blessed sacrament exactly the same thing happened. On several occasions I followed the procession of the host through the streets, and every time that a halt was made at some half-ruined church and the benediction was given from its steps, precisely the same double phenomenon was produced. I observed that the reserved host upon the altar of the church was all day long steadily pouring forth the former of the two influences, though not so strongly as at the moment of elevation or benediction. One might say that the light glowed upon the altar without ceasing, but shone forth as a sun at those moments of special effort. The action of the second forces, the second ray of light, could also be evoked from the reserved sacrament upon the altar, apparently at any time, though it seemed to me somewhat less vivid than the outpouring immediately after the consecration. Everything connected with the host, the tabernacle, the monstrance, the altar itself, the priest's vestments, the insulating humeral veil, the chalice and paten all were strongly charged with this tremendous magnetism. And all were radiating it forth, each in its degree. A third effect is that which is produced upon the communicant. He who receives into his body a part of that dazzling center, from which flow the light and the fire, becomes himself for the time a similar center, and radiates power in his turn. The tremendous waves of force which he has thus drawn into the closest possible association with himself cannot but seriously influence his higher bodies. For the time these waves raise his vibrations into harmony with themselves, thus producing a feeling of intense exaltation. This, however, is a considerable strain upon his various vehicles, which naturally tend gradually to fall back again to their normal rates. For a long time the indescribably vivid higher influence struggles against this tendency to slow down, but the dead weight of the comparatively enormous mass of the man's own ordinary undulations acts as a drag upon even its tremendous energy, and gradually brings it and themselves down to the common level. But undoubtedly every such experience draws the man just an infinitesimal fraction higher than he was before. He has been for a few moments or even for a few hours in direct contact with the forces of a world far higher than any that he himself can otherwise touch. Naturally, having watched all this, I then proceeded to make further investigations as to how far this outflowing of force was affected by the character, the knowledge or the intention of the priest. I may sum up briefly the results of the examination of a large number of cases in the form of 2 or 3 axioms, which will no doubt at first sight seem surprising to many of my readers. Ordination. First, only those priests who have been lawfully ordained, and have the apostolic succession, can produce this effect at all. Other men, not being part of this definite organization, cannot perform this feat, no matter how devoted or good or saintly they may be. Secondly, neither the character of the priest, nor his knowledge, nor ignorance as to what he is really doing, affects the result in any way whatever. If one thinks of it, neither of these statements ought to seem to us in any way astonishing, since it is obviously a question of being able to perform a certain action. And only those who have passed through a certain ceremony have received the gift of the ability to perform it. Just in the same way, in order to be able to speak to a certain set of people one must know their language, and a man who does not know that language cannot communicate with them, no matter how good and earnest and devoted he may be. Also, his ability to communicate with them is not affected by his private character, but only by the one fact that he has, or has not, the power to speak to them which is conferred by a knowledge of their language. I do not for a moment say that these other considerations are without their due effect. I shall speak of that later, but what I do say is that no one can draw upon this particular reservoir unless he has received the power to do so, which comes from a due appointment given according to the direction left by the Christ. I think that we can see a very good reason why precisely this arrangement has been made. Some plan was needed which should put a splendid outpouring of force within the reach of every one simultaneously in thousands of churches all over the world. I do not say that it might not be possible for a man of most exceptional power and holiness to call down through the strength of his devotion an amount of higher force commensurate with that obtained through the rites which I have described. But men of such exceptional power are always excessively rare, and it could never at any time of the world's history have been possible to find enough of them simultaneously to fill even 1,000th part of the places where they are needed. But here is a plan whose arrangement is to a certain extent mechanical. It is ordained that a certain act when duly performed shall be the recognized method of bringing down the force. And this can be done with comparatively little training by any one upon whom the power is conferred. A strong man is needed to pump up water, but any child can turn on a tap. It needs a strong man to make a door and to hang it in its place, but when it is once on its hinges any child can open it. Having myself been a priest of the Church of England, and knowing how keen are the disputes as to whether that church really has the apostolic succession or not, I was naturally interested in discovering whether its priests possessed this power. I was much pleased to find that they did, and I suppose we may take that as definitely settling the much disputed Parker question, and with it the whole controversy as to the authenticity of the orders of the Church of England. I soon found by examination that ministers of what are commonly called dissenting sects did not possess this power, no matter how good and earnest they might be. Their goodness and earnestness produced plenty of other effects which I shall presently describe, but their efforts did not draw upon the particular reservoir to which I have referred. I was especially interested in the case of one such minister whom I knew personally to be a good and devout man, and also a well-read theosophist. Here was a man who knew much more about the real meaning of the act of consecration than 999 out of 1,000 of the priests who constantly perform it. And yet I am bound to admit that his best effort did not produce this particular effect, while the others as unquestionably did. Once more, of course he produced other things which they did not, of which more anon. That at first somewhat surprised me, but I soon saw that it could not have been otherwise. Suppose, for example, that a certain sum of money is left by a rich Freemason for distribution among his poorer brethren, the law would never sanction the division of that money among any others than the Freemasons for whom it was intended. And the fact that other poor people outside the Masonic body might be more devout or more deserving would not weigh with it in the slightest degree. Another point which interested me greatly was the endeavor to discover to what extent, if at all, the intention of the priest affected the result produced. In the Roman Church I found many priests who went through the ceremony somewhat mechanically, and as a matter of daily duty, without any decided thought on the subject. But whether from ingrained reverence or from long habit, they always seemed to recover themselves just before the moment of consecration and to perform that act with a definite intention. The Anglican Church. I turned then to what is called the Low Church division of the Anglican community to see what would happen with them, because I knew that many of them would reject altogether the name of priest. And though they might follow the rubric in performing the act of consecration, their intention in doing it would be exactly the same as that of ministers of various denominations outside the church. Yet I found that the low churchmen could and did produce the effect, and that the others outside did not. Hence I infer that the intention, which is always said to be required, must be no more than the intention to do whatever the church means, without reference to the private opinion of the particular priest as to what that meaning is. I have no doubt that many people will think that all this ought to be quite differently arranged, but I can only report faithfully what my investigations have shown me to be the fact. I must not for a moment be understood as saying that the devotion and earnestness, the knowledge and the good character of the officiant make no difference. They make a great difference. But they do not affect the power to draw from that particular reservoir. When the priest is earnest and devoted, his whole feeling radiates out upon his people and calls forth similar feelings in such of them as are capable of expressing them. Also his devotion calls down its inevitable response, as shown in the illustration in thought forms, and the downpouring of force thus evoked benefits his congregation as well as himself. So that a priest who throws his heart and soul into the work which he does may be said to bring a double blessing upon his people, though the second class of influence can scarcely be considered as being of the same order of magnitude as the first. This second outpouring, which is drawn down by devotion itself, is of course to be found just as often outside the church as within it. Another factor to be taken into account is the feeling of the congregation. If their feeling is devout and reverent, it is of immense help to their teacher, and it enormously increases the amount of spiritual energy poured down as a response to devotion. The average intellectual level of the congregation is also a matter to be considered, for a man who is intelligent as well as pious has within him a devotion of a higher order than his more ignorant brother, and is therefore able to evoke a fuller response. On the other hand, in many places of worship where much is made of the exercise of the intellectual faculties, where for example the sermon and not the service is thought of as the principal feature, there is scarcely any real devotion. But instead of it a horrible spirit of criticism and of spiritual pride which effectually prevents the unfortunate audience from obtaining any good results at all from what they regard as their spiritual exercises. Devotional feeling or carelessness. Belief or skepticism on the part of the congregation make no difference whatever to the downflow from on high when there is a priest in charge who has the requisite qualifications to draw from the appointed reservoir. But naturally these factors make a difference as to the number of rays sent out from the consecrated host, and so to the general atmosphere of the church. The music. Another very important factor in the effect produced is the music which is used in the course of the service. Those who have read thought forms will remember the striking drawings that are there given of the enormous and splendid mental, astral and etheric erections which are built up by the influence of sound. The general action of sound is a question which I shall take up in another chapter, touching here only upon that side of it which belongs to the services of the Church. Here is another direction, unsuspected by the majority of those who participate in them, in which these services are capable of producing a wonderful and powerful effect. The devotion of the Church has always centered principally round the offering of the Mass as an act of the highest and purest adoration possible. And consequently the most exalted efforts of its greatest composers have been in connection with this service also. Here we may see one more example of the wisdom with which the arrangements were originally made, and of the crass ineptitude of those who have so blunderingly endeavored to improve them. The thought forms. Each of the great services of the Church, and more especially the celebration of the Eucharist, was originally designed to build up a mighty ordered form, expressing and surrounding a central idea, a form which would facilitate and direct the radiation of the influence upon the entire village which was grouped round the church. The idea of the service may be said to be a double one, to receive and distribute the great outpouring of spiritual force, and to gather up the devotion of the people, and offer it before the throne of God. In the case of the Mass as celebrated by the Roman or the Greek Church, the different parts of the service are grouped round the central act of consecration distinctly with a view to the symmetry of the great form produced, as well as to their direct effect upon the worshippers. The alterations made in the English Prayer Book in 1552 were evidently the work of people who were ignorant of this side of the question. For they altogether disturbed that symmetry, which is one reason why it is an eminently desirable thing for the Church of England that it should as speedily as possible so arrange its affairs as to obtain permission to use as an alternative the Mass of King Edward VI according to the Prayer Book of 1549. One of the most important effects of the church service, both upon the immediate congregation and upon the surrounding district, has always been the creation of these beautiful and devotional thought forms, through which the downpouring of life and strength from higher worlds can more readily take effect. These are better made and their efficiency enhanced when a considerable portion of those who take part in the service do so with intelligent comprehension, yet even when the devotion is ignorant the result is still beautiful and uplifting. Most of the sects, which unhappily broke away from the Church, entirely lost sight of this inner and more important side of public worship. The idea of the service offered to God almost disappeared, and its place was largely taken by the fanatical preaching of narrow theological dogmas which were always unimportant and frequently ridiculous. Readers have sometimes expressed surprise that those who write from the occult standpoint should seem so decidedly to favor the practices of the Church, rather than those of the various sects whose thought is in many ways more liberal. The reason is shown precisely in this consideration of the inner side of things on which we are now engaged. The occult student recognizes most fully the value of the effort which made liberty of conscience and of thought possible. Yet he cannot but see that those who cast aside the splendid old forms and services of the Church lost in that very act almost the whole of the occult side of their religion, and made of it essentially a selfish and limited thing, a question chiefly of personal salvation for the individual, instead of the grateful offering of worship to God, which is in itself the never-failing channel through which the divine love is poured forth upon all. The attainment of mental freedom was a necessary step in the process of human evolution. The clumsy and brutal manner in which it was obtained, and the foolishness of the excesses into which gross ignorance led its champions, are responsible for many of the deplorable results which we see at the present day. The same savage, senseless lust for wanton destruction that moved Cromwell's brutal soldiers to break priceless statues and irreplaceable stained glass, has deprived us also of the valuable effect produced in higher worlds by perpetual prayers for the dead, and by the practically universal devotion of the common people to the saints and angels. Then the great mass of the people was religious even though ignorantly religious, now it is frankly and even boastfully irreligious. Perhaps this transitory stage is a necessary one, but it can hardly be considered in itself either beautiful or satisfactory. The effect of devotion. No other service has an effect at all comparable to that of the celebration of the Mass, but the great musical forms may of course appear at any service where music is used. In all the other services, except indeed the Catholic benediction of the Blessed Sacrament, the thought forms developed and the general good which is done depend to a great extent upon the devotion of the people. Now devotion, whether individual or collective, varies much in quality. The devotion of the primitive savage, for example, is usually greatly mingled with fear, and the chief idea in his mind in connection with it is to appease a deity who might otherwise prove vindictive. But little better than this is much of the devotion of men who consider themselves civilized. For it is a kind of unholy bargain, the offering to the deity of a certain amount of devotion if he on his side will extend a certain amount of protection or assistance. Such devotion, being entirely selfish and grasping in its nature, produces results only in the lower types of astral matter, and exceedingly unpleasant-looking results they are in many cases. The thought forms which they create are often shaped like grappling hooks, and their forces move always in closed curves, reacting only upon the man who sends them forth, and bringing back to him whatever small result they may be able to achieve. The true, pure, unselfish devotion is an outrush of feeling which never returns to the man who gave it forth, but constitutes itself in very truth a cosmic force producing widespread results in higher worlds. Though the force itself never returns, the man who originates it becomes the center of a downpour of divine energy which comes in response, and so in his act of devotion he has truly blessed himself. Even though at the same time he has also blessed many others as well, and in addition to that has had the unequaled honor of contributing to the mighty reservoir of the Nirmanakaya. Anyone who possesses the book Thought Forms may see in it an attempt to represent the splendid blue spire made by devotion of this type as it rushes upwards. And he will readily understand how it opens a way for a definite outpouring of the divine force of the solar deity. He is pouring forth his wonderful vital energy on every level in every world, and naturally the outpouring belonging to a higher world is stronger and fuller and less restricted than that upon the world below. Normally, each wave of this great force acts in its own world alone, and cannot or does not move transversely from one world to another. But it is precisely by means of unselfish thought and feeling, whether it be of devotion or of affection, that a temporary channel is provided through which the force normally belonging to a higher world may descend to a lower, and may produce their results which, without it, could never have come to pass. Every man who is truly unselfish frequently makes himself such a channel, though of course on a comparatively small scale. But the mighty act of devotion of a whole vast congregation, where it is really united, and utterly without thought of self, produces the same result on an enormously greater scale. Sometimes, though rarely, this occult side of religious services may be seen in full activity. And no one who has even once had the privilege of seeing such a splendid manifestation as this can for a moment doubt the hidden side of a church service is of an importance infinitely greater than anything purely physical. Such an one would see the dazzling blue spiral or dome of the highest type of astral matter rushing upwards into the sky, far above the image of it in stone which sometimes crowns the physical edifice in which the worshippers are gathered. He would see the blinding glory which pours down through it and spreads out like a great flood of living light over all the surrounding region. Naturally, the diameter and the height of the spire of devotion determine the opening made for the descent of the higher life. While the force which expresses itself in the rate at which the devotional energy rushes upwards has its relation to the rate at which the corresponding downpouring can take place. The sight is indeed a wonderful one, and he who sees it can never doubt again that the unseen influences are more than the seen, nor can he fail to realize that the world which goes on its way heedless of the devotional man, or perhaps even scornful of him, owes to him all the time far more than it knows. The power of the ordained priest is a reality in other ceremonies than the celebration of the Eucharist. The consecration of the water in the rite of baptism, or of the holy water which is to be distributed to the faithful or kept at the entrance of the church, pours into it a strong influence, which enables it in each case to perform the part assigned to it. The same is true of other consecrations and benedictions which come in the course of the regular work of the priest. Though in many of these it seems that a somewhat larger proportion of the effect is produced by the direct magnetism of the priest himself. And the amount of that of course depends upon the energy and earnestness with which he performs his part of the ceremony. Holy water. We shall find it interesting to study the hidden side of some of these minor services of the Church, and the work done by her priests. Into the making of holy water, for example, the mesmeric element enters very strongly. The priest first takes clean water and clean salt, and then proceeds to demagnetize them, to remove from them any casual exterior influences with which they may have been permeated. Having done this very thoroughly, he then charges them with spiritual power, each separately and with many earnest repetitions, and then finally with further fervent adjurations he casts the salt into the water in the form of a cross. And the operation is finished. If this ceremony be properly and carefully performed, the water becomes a highly effective talisman for the special purposes for which it is charged, that it shall drive away from the man who uses it all worldly and warring thought, and shall turn him in the direction of purity and devotion. The student of occultism will readily comprehend how this must be so, and when he sees with astral sight the discharge of the higher force which takes place when anyone uses or sprinkles this holy water, he will have no difficulty in realizing that it must be a powerful factor in driving away undesirable thought and feeling, and quelling all irregular vibrations of the astral and mental bodies. In every case where the priest does his work, the spiritual force flows through, but he may add greatly to it by the fervor of his own devotion, and the vividness with which he realizes what he is doing. Baptism. The sacrament of baptism, as originally administered, had a real and beautiful hidden side. In those older days the water was magnetized with a special view to the effect of its vibrations upon the higher vehicles, so that all the germs of good qualities in the unformed astral and mental bodies of the child might thereby receive a strong stimulus, while at the same time the germs of evil might be isolated and deadened. The central idea no doubt was to take this early opportunity of fostering the growth of the good germs, in order that their development might precede that of the evil, in order that when at a later period the latter germs begin to bear their fruit, the good might already be so far evolved that the control of the evil would be a comparatively easy matter. This is one side of the baptismal ceremony. It has also another aspect, as typical of the initiation towards which it is hoped that the young member of the Church will direct his steps as he grows up. It is a consecration and a setting apart of the new set of vehicles to the true expression of the soul within, and to the service of the great white brotherhood. Yet it also has its occult side with regard to these new vehicles themselves, and when the ceremony is properly and intelligently performed there can be no doubt that its effect is a powerful one. Union is strength. The economy and efficiency of the whole scheme of the Lord Maitreya depend upon the fact that much greater powers can easily be arranged for a small body of men, who are spiritually prepared to receive them, than could possibly be universally distributed without a waste of energy which could not be contemplated for a moment. In the Hindu scheme, for example, every man is a priest for his own household, and therefore we have to deal with millions of such priests of all possible varieties of temperament, and not in any way specially prepared. The scheme of the ordination of priests gives a certain greater power to a limited number, who have by that very ordination been specially set apart for the work. Carrying the same principle a little further, a set of still higher powers are given to a still smaller number, the bishops. They are made channels for the force which confers ordination, and for the much smaller manifestation of the same force which accompanies the rite of confirmation. The hidden side of these ceremonies is always one of great interest to the student of the realities of life. There are many cases now, unfortunately, where all these things are mere matters of form, and though that does not prevent their result, it does minimize it. But where the old forms are used as they were meant to be used, the unseen effect is out of all proportion to anything that is visible in the physical world. Consecration. To the bishop also is restricted the power of consecrating a church or a churchyard, and the occult side of this is a really pretty sight. It is interesting to watch the growth of the sort of fortification which the officiant builds as he marches round uttering the prescribed prayers and verses. To note the expulsion of any ordinary thought forms which may happen to have been there, and the substitution for them of the orderly and devotional forms to which henceforth this building is supposed to be dedicated. The bells. There are many minor consecrations which are of great interest, the blessing of bells, for example. The ringing of bells has a distinct part in the scheme of the Church, which in these days seems but little understood. The modern theory appears to be that they are meant to call people together at the time when the service is about to be performed, and there is no doubt that in the Middle Ages, when there were no clocks or watches, they were put to precisely this use. From this restricted view of the intention of the bell has grown the idea that anything which makes a noise will serve the purpose. And in most towns of England Sunday morning is made into a purgatory by the simultaneous but discordant clanging of a number of unmusical lumps of metal. At intervals we recognize the true use of the bells, as when we employ them on great festivals or on occasions of public rejoicing. For a peal of musical bells, sounding harmonious notes, is the only thing which was contemplated by the original plan, and these were intended to have a double influence. Some remnant of this still remains, though but half understood, in the science of campanology. And those who know the delights of the proper performance of a trip bob major or a grandsire bobcador will perhaps be prepared to hear how singularly perfect and magnificent are the forms which are made by them. This then was one of the effects which the ordered ringing of the bells was intended to produce. It was to throw out a stream of musical forms repeated over and over again, in precisely the same way, and for precisely the same purpose. As the Christian monk repeats hundreds of Ave Marias or the northern Buddhist spends much of his life in reiterating the mystic syllables Om Mani Padme Hum, or many a Hindu makes a background to his life by reciting the name Sita Ram. A particular thought form and its meaning were in this way impressed over and over again upon all the astral bodies within hearing. The blessing of the bells was intended to add an additional quality to these undulations, of whatever kind they may have been. The ringing of the bells in different order would naturally produce different forms. But whatever the forms may be, they are produced by the vibration of the same bells, and if these bells are, to begin with, strongly charged with a certain type of magnetism, every form made by them will bear with it something of that influence. It is as though the wind which wafts to us snatches of music should at the same time bear with it a subtle perfume. So the bishop who blesses the bells charges them with much the same intent as he would bless holy water, with the intention that, wherever this sound shall go, all evil thought and feeling shall be banished and harmony and devotion shall prevail, a real exercise of magic, and quite effective when the magician does his work properly. The sacring bell, which is rung inside the church, at the moment of the reciting of the Tersanctus or the elevation of the host, has a different intention. In the huge cathedrals which medieval piety erected, it was impossible for all the worshippers to hear what the priest was saying in the recitation of the Mass, even before the present system of what is called recitation in secret was adopted. And therefore the server, who is close to the altar and follows the movements of the priest, has it among his duties to announce in this way to the congregation when these critical points of the service are reached. The bell which is often rung in Hindu or Buddhist temples has yet another intention. The original thought here was a beautiful and altruistic one. When someone had just uttered an act of devotion or made an offering, there came down in reply to that a certain outpouring of spiritual force. This charged the bell among other objects, and the idea of the man who struck it was that by so doing he would spread abroad, as far as the sound of the bell could reach, the vibration of this higher influence while it was still fresh and strong. Now it is to be feared that the true signification has been so far forgotten that there are actually some who believe it necessary in order to attract the attention of their deity. Incense. The same idea carried out in a different way shows itself to us in the blessing of the incense before it is burned. For the incense has always a dual significance. It ascends before God as a symbol of the prayers of the people. But also it spreads through the church as a symbol of the sweet savor of the blessing of God, and so once more the priest pours into it a holy influence with the idea that wherever it's sent may penetrate. Wherever the smallest particle of that which has been blessed may pass, it shall bear with it a feeling of peace and of purity, and shall chase away all inharmonious thoughts and sensations. Even apart from the blessing, its influence is good, for it is carefully compounded from gums the undulation rate of which harmonizes perfectly with spiritual and devotional vibrations, but is distinctly hostile to almost all others. The magnetization may merely intensify its natural characteristics, or may add to it other special oscillations, but in any case its use in connection with religious ceremonies is always good. The scent of sandalwood has many of the same characteristics, and the scent of pure attar of roses, though utterly different in character, has also a good effect. Another point which is to a large extent new in the scheme prepared by its founder for the Christian Church is the utilization of the enormous force which exists in united synchronous action. In Hindu or Buddhist temples each man comes when he chooses, makes his little offering or utters his few words of prayer and praise, and then retires. Result follows each such effort in proportion to the energy of real feeling put into it, and in this way a fairly constant stream of tiny consequences is achieved. But we never get the massive effect produced by the simultaneous efforts of a congregation of hundreds or thousands of people, or the heart-stirring vibrations which accompany the singing of some well-known processional hymn. By thus working together at a service we obtain four separate objects. 1. Whatever is the aim of the invocatory part of the service, a large number of people join in asking for it, and so send out a huge thought form. 2. A correspondingly large amount of force flows in and stimulates the spiritual faculties of the people. 3. The simultaneous effort synchronizes the undulations of their bodies, and so makes them more receptive. 4. Their attention being directed to the same object, they work together and thus stimulate one another. Services for the dead. What I have said in the earlier part of this chapter will explain a feature which is often misunderstood by those who ridicule the Church: the offering of a Mass with a certain intention, or on behalf of a certain dead person. The idea is that that person shall benefit by the downpouring of force which comes on that particular occasion, and undoubtedly he does so benefit, for the strong thought about him cannot but attract his attention. And when he is in that way drawn to the Church he takes part in the ceremony and enjoys a large share of its result. Even if he is still in a condition of unconsciousness, as sometime happens to the newly dead, the exertion of the priest's will, or his earnest prayer, which is the same thing, directs the stream of force towards the person for whom it is intended. Such an effort is a perfectly legitimate act of invocatory magic. Unfortunately, an entirely illegitimate and evil element is often imported into the transaction by the exaction of a fee for the exercise of this occult power, thing which is always inadmissible. Other religions. I have been trying to expound something of the inner meaning of the ceremonies of the Christian Church, taking that, in the first place, because it is with that I am most familiar. And in the second place because it presents some interesting features which in their present form may be said to be new ideas imported into the scheme of things by our present Bodhisattva. I do not wish it to be supposed that I have expounded the Christian ceremonies because I regard that religion as in any way the best expression of universal truth. The fact that I, who am one of its priests, have publicly proclaimed myself a Buddhist, shows clearly that that is not my opinion. So far as its teaching goes, Christianity is probably more defective than any other of the great religions, with perhaps the doubtful exception of Mohammedanism. But that is not because of any neglect on the part of the original founder to make his system a perfectly arranged exposition of the truth. But because most unfortunately the ignorant majority of the early Christians cast out from among themselves the great Gnostic doctors, and thereby left themselves with a sadly mutilated doctrine. The founder may perhaps have foreseen this failure, for he supplied his church with a system of magic which would continue to work mechanically, even though his people should forget much of the early meaning of what he had taught them. And it is precisely the force which has lain behind this mechanical working which explains the remarkable hold so long maintained by a church which intellectually has nothing to give to its followers. Those who profess other religions must not then suppose that I mean any disrespect to their faiths because I have chosen for exposition that with which I am most familiar. The general principles of the action of ceremonial magic which I have laid down are equally true for all religions, and each must apply them for himself. The orders of clergy. Perhaps I ought to explain, for the benefit of our Indian readers, that there are three orders among the Christian clergy: bishops, priests and deacons. When a man is first ordained he is admitted as a deacon, which means, practically, a kind of apprentice or assistant priest. He has not yet the power to consecrate the sacrament, to bless the people or to forgive their sins. He can, however, baptize children, but even a layman is permitted to do that in case of emergency. After a year in the diaconate he is eligible for ordination as a priest, and it is this second ordination which confers upon him the power to draw forth the force from the reservoir of which I have spoken. To him is then given the power to consecrate the host and also various other objects, to bless the people in the name of the Christ, and to pronounce the forgiveness of their sins. In addition to all these powers, the bishop has that of ordaining other priests, and so carrying on the apostolic succession. He alone has the right to administer the rite of confirmation, and to consecrate a church, that is to say, to set it apart for the service of God. These three are the only orders which mean definite grades, separated from one another by ordinations which confer different powers. You may hear many titles applied to the Christian clergy, such as those of archbishop, archdeacon, dean or canon, but these are only the titles of offices, and involve differences of duty, but not of grade in the sense of spiritual power. Chapter 9. By sounds. Sound, color and form. We have considered the influences radiating from the walls of our churches, and the effect of the ceremonies performed within them. It still remains for us to mention the hidden side of the music of their services. There are many people who realize that sound always generates color, that every note which is played or sung has overtones which produce the effect of light when seen by an eye even slightly clairvoyant. Not every one, however, knows that sounds also build form just as thoughts do. Yet this is nevertheless the case. It was long ago shown that sound gives rise to form in the physical world by singing a certain note into a tube across the end of which was stretched a membrane upon which fine sand or lycopodium powder had been cast. In this way it was proved that each sound threw the sand into a certain definite shape, and that the same note always produced the same shape. It is not, however, with forms caused in this way that we are dealing just now, but with those built up in etheric, astral and mental matter, which persist and continue in vigorous action long after the sound itself has died away. So far as physical ears are concerned. Religious music. Let us take, for example, the hidden side of the performance of a piece of music, say the playing of a voluntary upon a church organ. This has its effect in the physical world upon those of the worshippers who have an ear for music, who have educated themselves to understand and to appreciate it. But many people who do not understand it and have no technical knowledge of the subject are yet conscious of a very decided effect which it produces upon them. The clairvoyant student is in no way surprised at this, for he sees that each piece of music as it is performed upon the organ builds up gradually an enormous edifice in etheric, astral and mental matter. Extending away above the organ and far through the roof of the church like a kind of castellated mountain range, all composed of glorious flashing colors coruscating and blazing in a most marvelous manner. Like the aurora borealis in the Arctic regions. The nature of this differs very much in the case of different composers. An overture by Wagner makes always a magnificent whole with splendid splashes of vivid color, as though he built with mountains of flame for stones. One of Bach's fugues builds up a mighty ordered form, bold yet precise, rugged but symmetrical, with parallel rivulets of silver or gold or ruby running through it, marking the successive appearances of motif. One of Mendelssohn's Lieder own work makes a lovely airy erection, a sort of castle of filigree work in frosted silver. In the book called Thought Forms will be found 3 illustrations in color, in which we have endeavored to depict the forms built by pieces of music by Mendelssohn, Gounod and Wagner respectively, and I would refer the reader to these. For this is one of the cases in which it is quite impossible to imagine the appearance of the form without actually seeing it or some representation of it. It may someday be possible to issue a book containing studies of a number of such forms, for the purpose of careful examination and comparison. It is evident that the study of such sound forms would be a science in itself, and one of surpassing interest. These forms, created by the performers of the music, must not be confounded with the magnificent thought form which the composer himself made as the expression of his own music in the higher worlds. This is a production worthy of the great mind from which it emanated, and often persists for many years, sometimes even over centuries. If the composer is so far understood and appreciated that his original conception is strengthened by the thoughts of his admirers. In the same manner, though with wide difference of type, magnificent erections are constructed in higher worlds by a great poet's idea of his epic, or a great writer's idea of the subject which he means to put before his readers, such. For example, as Wagner's immortal trilogy of The Ring, Dante's grand representation of purgatory and paradise, and Ruskin's conception of what art ought to be and of what he desired to make it. The forms made by the performance of the music persist for a considerable space of time, varying from 1 hour to 3 or 4. And all the time they are sending out radiations which assuredly influence for good every soul within a radius of half a mile or more. Not that the soul necessarily knows it, nor that the influence is at all equal in all cases. The sensitive person is greatly uplifted, while the dull and preoccupied man is but little affected. Still, however unconsciously, each person must be a little the better for coming under such an influence. Naturally the undulations extend much farther than the distance named, but beyond that they grow rapidly weaker, and in a great city they are soon drowned in the rush of swirling currents which fill the astral world in such places. In the quiet country amidst the fields and the trees the edifice lasts proportionately much longer, and its influence has a wider area. Sometimes in such a case those who may see crowds of beautiful nature spirits admiring the splendid forms built by the music, and bathing with delight in the waves of influence which they send forth. It is surely a beautiful thought that every organist who does his work well, and throws his whole soul into what he plays, is thus doing far more good than he knows, and helping many whom perhaps he never saw and never will know in this life. Another point which is interesting in this connection is the difference between the edifices built by the same music when rendered upon different instruments as, for example, the difference in appearance of the form built by a certain piece when played upon a church organ and the same piece executed by an orchestra or by a violin quartet, or played on a piano. In these cases the form is identical if the music be equally well rendered, but the whole texture is different, and naturally, in the case of the violin quartet, the size of the form is far less, because the volume of sound is so much less. The form built by the piano is often somewhat larger than that of the violins, but is not so accurate in detail, and its proportions are less perfect. Again, a decided difference in texture is visible between the effect of a violin solo and the same solo played upon the flute. Surrounding and blending with these forms, although perfectly distinct from them, are the forms of thought and feeling produced by human beings under the influence of the music. The size and vividness of these depend upon the appreciativeness of the audience and the extent to which they are affected. Sometimes the form built by the sublime conception of a master of harmony stands alone in its beauty, unattended and unnoticed. Because such mental faculties as the congregation may possess are entirely absorbed in millinery or the calculations of the money market. While on the other hand the chain of simple forms built by the force of some well-known hymn may in some cases be almost hidden by great blue clouds of devotional feeling evoked from the hearts of the singers. Another factor which determines the appearance of the edifice constructed by a piece of music is the quality of the performance. The thought form left hanging over a church after the performance of the Hallelujah chorus infallibly and distinctly shows, for example, if the bass solo has been flat, or if any of the parts have been noticeably weaker than the others. As in either case there is an obvious failure in the symmetry and clearness of the form. Naturally there are types of music whose forms are anything but lovely, though even these have their interest as objects of study. The curious broken shapes which surround an academy for young ladies at the pupils' practicing hour are at least remarkable and instructive, if not beautiful. And the chains thrown out in lasso-like loops and curves by the child who is industriously playing scales or arpeggios are by no means without their charm, when there are no broken or missing links. Singing. A song with a chorus constructs a form in which a number of beads are strung at equal distances upon a silver thread of melody, the size of the beads of course depending upon the strength of the chorus. Just as the luminosity and beauty of the connecting thread depend upon the voice and expression of the solo singer, while the form into which the thread is plaited depends upon the character of the melody. Of great interest also are the variations in metallic texture produced by different qualities of voice, the contrast between the soprano and the tenor, the alto and the bass, and again the difference between a boy's voice and a woman's. Very beautiful also is the intertwining of these four threads, quite unlike in color and in texture, in the singing of a glee or a part song, or their ordered and yet constantly varied march side by side in the singing of a hymn. A processional hymn builds a series of rectangular forms drawn with mathematical precision, following one another in definite order like the links of some mighty chain, or still more, unpoetical though it sounds, like the carriages of some huge train belonging to the astral world. Very striking also is the difference in ecclesiastical music, between the broken though glittering fragments of the Anglican chant, and the splendid glowing uniformity of the Gregorian tone. Not unlike the latter is the effect produced by the monotonous chanting of Sanskrit verses by pundits in India. It may be asked here how far the feeling of the musician himself affects the form which is built by his efforts. His feelings do not, strictly speaking, affect the musical structure at all. If the delicacy and brilliancy of his execution remain the same, it makes no difference to that musical form whether he himself feels happy or miserable, whether his musings are grave or gay. His emotions naturally produce vibrant forms in astral matter, just as do those of his audience, but these merely surround the great shape built by the music, and in no way interfere with it. His comprehension of the music, and the skill of his rendering of it, show themselves in the edifice which he constructs. A poor and merely mechanical performance erects a structure which, though it may be accurate in form, is deficient in color and luminosity, a form which, as compared with the work of a real musician, gives a curious impression of being constructed of cheap materials. To obtain really grand results the performer must forget all about himself, must lose himself utterly in the music as only a genius may dare to do. Military music. The powerful and inspiring effect produced by military music is readily comprehensible to the clairvoyant who is able to see the long stream of rhythmically vibrating forms which is left behind by the band as it marches along at the head of the column. Not only does the regular beat of these undulations tend to strengthen those of the astral bodies of the soldiers, thus training them to move more strongly and in unison, but the very forms which are created themselves radiate strength and courage and material ardor, so that a body of men which before seemed to be hopelessly disorganized by fatigue, may in this way be pulled together again and endowed with a considerable accession of strength. It is instructive to watch the mechanism of this change. A man who is utterly exhausted has to a great extent lost the power of coordination, the central will can no longer hold together and govern as it should the different parts of the body. Every physical cell is complaining, raising its own separate cry of pain and remonstrance. And the effect upon all the vehicles, etheric, astral, and mental, is that a vast number of small separate vortices are set up, each quivering at its own rate, so that all the bodies are losing their cohesion and their power to do their work, to bear their part in the life of the man. Carried to its ultimate extreme this would mean death, but short of that it means utter disorganization and the loss of the power to make the muscles obey the will. When upon the astral body in this condition there comes the impact of a succession of steady and powerful oscillations, that impact supplies for the time the place of the will force which has so sorely slackened. The bodies are once more brought into synchronous vibration and are held so by the sweep of the music, thus giving the will power an opportunity to recover itself and take again the command which it had so nearly abandoned. So marked and powerful are the waves sent forth by good military music that a sensation of positive pleasure is produced in those who move in obedience to them. Just as effective dance music arouses the desire for synchronous movement in all who hear it. The type of the instruments employed in military bands is also of a nature which adds greatly to this effect. The strength and sharpness of the vibration being obviously of far greater importance for those purposes than its delicacy or its power to express the finer emotions. Sounds in nature. It is not only the ordered arrangement of sound which we call music which produces definite form. Every sound in nature has its effect, and in some cases these effects are of the most remarkable character. The majestic roll of a thunderstorm creates usually a vast flowing band of color, while the deafening crash often calls into temporary existence an arrangement of irregular radiations from a center suggestive of an exploded bomb. Or sometimes a huge irregular sphere with great spikes projecting from it in all directions. The never-ceasing beating of the sea upon the land fringes all Earth's coasts with an eternal canopy of wavy yet parallel lines of lovely changing color, rising into tremendous mountain ranges when the sea is lashed by a storm. The rustling of the wind among the leaves of the forest covers it with a beautiful iridescent network, ever rising and falling with gentle wave-like movement, like the passing of the wind across a field of wheat. Sometimes this hovering cloud is pierced by curving lines and loops of light, representing the song of the birds, like fragments of a silver chain cast forth and ringing melodiously in the air. Of these there is an almost infinite variety, from the beautiful golden globes produced by the notes of the campanero, to the amorphous and coarsely colored mass which is the result of the scream of a parrot or of a macaw. The roar of the lion may be seen as well as heard by those whose eyes are opened. Indeed, it is by no means impossible that some of the wild creatures possess this much of clairvoyance. And that the terrifying effect which is alleged to be produced by this sound may be largely owing to the radiations poured forth from the form to which it gives birth. In domestic life. In more domestic life similar effects are observed. The purring cat surrounds himself with concentric rosy cloud films which expand constantly outward until they dissipate, shedding an influence of drowsy contentment and well-being which tends to reproduce itself in the human beings about him. The barking dog, on the other hand, shoots forth well-defined sharp-pointed projectiles which strike with a severe shock upon the astral bodies of those in his neighborhood. And this is the reason of the extreme nervous irritation which this constantly repeated sound often produces in sensitive persons. The sharp, spiteful yap of the terrier discharges a series of forms not unlike the modern rifle bullet, which pierce the astral body in various directions, and seriously disturb its economy. While the deep bay of a bloodhound throws off beads like ostrich eggs or footballs which are slower in motion and far less calculated to injure. Some of these canine missiles pierce like sword thrusts, while some are duller and heavier, like the blows of a club, and they vary greatly in strength, but all alike are evil in their action upon the mental and astral bodies. The color of these projectiles is usually some shade of red or brown, varying with the emotion of the animal and the key in which his voice is pitched. It is instructive to contrast with these the blunt-ended, clumsy shapes produced by the lowing of a cow, forms which have often somewhat the appearance of logs of wood or fragments of a tree trunk. A flock of sheep frequently surrounds itself with a many-pointed yet amorphous cloud of sound which is by no means unlike the physical dust cloud which it raises as it moves along. The cooing of a pair of doves throws off a constant succession of graceful curved forms like the letter S reversed. The tones of the human voice also produce their results which often endure long after the sounds which made them have died away. An angry ejaculation throws itself forth like a scarlet spear, and many a woman surrounds herself with an intricate network of hard, brown-gray metallic lines by the stream of silly meaningless chatter which she ceaselessly babbles forth. Such a network permits the passage of vibration only at its own low level. It is an almost perfect barrier against the impact of any of the higher and more beautiful thoughts and feelings. A glimpse of the astral body of a garrulous person is thus a striking object lesson to the student of occultism, and it teaches him the virtue of speaking only when it is necessary, or when he has something pleasant and useful to say. Another instructive comparison is that between the forms produced by different kinds of laughter. The happy laughter of a child bubbles forth in rosy curves, making a kind of scalloped balloon shape, an epicycloid of mirth. The ceaseless guffaw of the empty-minded causes an explosive effect in an irregular mass, usually brown or dirty green in color according to the predominant tint of the aura from which it emanates. The sneering laugh throws out a shapeless projectile of a dull red color, usually flecked with brownish green and bristling with thorny-looking points. The constantly repeated cachinnations of the self-conscious create a very unpleasant result, surrounding them with what in appearance and color resembles the surface of a pool of boiling mud. The nervous giggles of a schoolgirl often involve her in an unpleasant seaweed-like tangle of lines of brown and dull yellow, while the jolly-hearted, kindly laugh of genuine amusement usually billows out in rounded forms of gold and green. The consequences flowing from the bad habit of whistling are usually decidedly unpleasant. If it be soft and really musical, it produces an effect not unlike that of a small flute, but sharper and more metallic, but the ordinary tuneless horror of the London street boy sends out a series of small and piercing projectiles of dirty brown. Noises. An enormous number of artificial noises, most of them transcendently hideous, are constantly being produced all about us, for our so-called civilization is surely the noisiest with which earth has ever yet been cursed. These also have their unseen side, though it is rarely one which is pleasant to contemplate. The strident screech of a railway engine makes a far more penetrating and powerful projectile than even the barking of a dog. Indeed, it is surpassed in horror only by the scream of the steam siren which is sometimes employed to call together the hands at a factory, or by the report of heavy artillery at close quarters. The railway whistle blows forth a veritable sword, with the added disintegrating power of a serious electrical shock. And its effect upon the astral body which is unfortunate enough to be within its reach is quite comparable to that of a sword thrust upon the physical body. Fortunately for us, astral matter possesses many of the properties of a fluid, so that the wound heals after a few minutes have passed, but the effect of the shock upon the astral organism disappears by no means so readily. The flight through the landscape of a train which is not screaming is not wholly unbeautiful. For the heavy parallel lines which are drawn by the sound of its onward rush are as it were embroidered by the intermittent spheres or ovals caused by the puffing of the engine, so that a train seen in the distance crossing the landscape leaves behind it a temporary appearance of a strip of Brobdingnagian ribbon with a scalloped edging. The discharge of one of the great modern cannons is an explosion of sound just as surely as of gunpowder. And the tremendous radiation of impacts which it throws out to the radius of a mile or so is calculated to have a very serious effect upon astral currents and astral bodies. The rattle of rifle or pistol fire throws out a sheaf of small needles, which are also eminently undesirable in their effect. It is abundantly clear that all loud, sharp or sudden sounds should, as far as possible, be avoided by anyone who wishes to keep his astral and mental vehicles in good order. This is one among the many reasons which make the life of the busy city one to be avoided by the occult student, for its perpetual roar means the ceaseless beating of disintegrating vibrations upon each of his vehicles, and this is, of course, quite apart from the even more serious play of sordid passions and emotions which make dwelling in a main street like living beside an open sewer. No one who watches the effect of these repeated sound forms upon the sensitive astral body can doubt that there must follow from them a serious permanent result which cannot fail to be to some extent communicated to the physical nerves. So serious and so certain is this, that I believe that if it were possible to obtain accurate statistics on such a point, we should find the length of life much shorter and the percentage of nervous breakdown and insanity appreciably higher among the inhabitants of a street paved with granite, than among those who have advantage of asphalt. The value and even the necessity of quiet is by no means sufficiently appreciated in our modern life. Specially do we ignore the disastrous effect upon the plastic astral and mental bodies of children of all this ceaseless, unnecessary noise. Yet that is largely responsible for evils of many kinds and for weaknesses which show themselves with fatal effect in later life. There is a yet higher point of view from which all the sounds of nature blend themselves into one mighty tone, that which the Chinese authors have called the kung. And this also has its form an inexpressible compound or synthesis of all forms, vast and changeful as the sea, and yet through it all upholding an average level, just as the sea does, all penetrating yet all embracing. The note which represents our earth in the music of the spheres, the form which is our petal when the solar system is regarded from that plane where it is seen all spread out like a lotus. Chapter 10. By Public Opinion. Race Prejudice. When anything occurs to prevent us from doing or saying exactly what we should like to do, we are in the habit of congratulating ourselves that thought at least is free. But this is only another of the many popular delusions. For the average man thought is by no means free, on the contrary it is conditioned by a large number of powerful limitations. It is bound by the prejudices of the nation, the religion, the class to which he happens to belong, and it is only by a determined and long-continued effort that he can shake himself free from all these influences, and really think for himself. These restrictions operate on him in two ways: they modify his opinion about facts and about actions. Taking the former first, he sees nothing as it really is, but only as his fellow countrymen, his co-religionists, or the members of his caste think it to be. When we come to know more of other races we shake off our preconceptions concerning them. But we have only to look back a century to the time of Napoleon, and we shall at once perceive that no Englishman then could possibly have formed an impartial opinion as to the character of that remarkable man. Public opinion in England had erected him into a kind of bogey. Nothing was too terrible or too wicked to be believed of him, and indeed it is doubtful whether the common people really considered him as a human being at all. The prepossession against everything French was then so strong that to say that a man was a Frenchman was to believe him capable of any villainy. And one cannot but admit that those who had fresh in their minds the unspeakable crimes of the French Revolution had some justification for such an attitude. They were too near to the events to be able to see them in proportion. And because the offscourings of the streets of Paris had contrived to seize upon the government and to steep themselves in orgies of blood and crime, they thought that these represented the people of France. It is easy to see how far from the truth must have been the conception of the Frenchman in the mind of the average English peasant of that period. Among our higher classes the century which has passed since then has produced an entire revolution of feeling, and now we cordially admire our neighbors across the Channel, because now we know so much more of them. Yet even now it is not impossible that there may be remote country places in which something of that old and strongly established prejudice still survives. For the leading countries of the world are in reality as yet only partially civilized, and while everywhere the more cultured classes are prepared to receive foreigners politely, the same can hardly be said of the mill hands or the colliers. And there are still parts of Europe where the Jew is hardly regarded as a human being. Popular prejudice. It needs little argument to show that everywhere among the less cultured people prejudgments are still strong and utterly unreasonable. But we who think ourselves above them, even we need to be careful, lest unconsciously we allow them to influence us. To stand against a strong popular bias is no easy matter, and the student of occultism will at once see why this is so. The whole atmosphere is full of thought forms and currents of thought, and these are ceaselessly acting and reacting upon every one of us. The tendency of any thought form is to reproduce itself. It is charged with a certain rate of vibration, and its nature is to influence every mental and astral body with which it comes into contact in the direction of the same vibration. There are many matters about which opinion is reasonably equally divided, as, for example, the angle at which one should wear 1 foot's hat, or whether one should be a liberal or a conservative. Consequently the general average of thought on these matters is no stronger in one direction than in another, and about them and other such matters it may be said that thought is comparatively free. But there are other subjects upon which there is an overwhelming consensus of public opinion in one direction, and that amounts to so strong a pressure of a certain set of undulations connected with that subject upon the mental body, that unless a man is unusually strong and determined he will be swept into the general current. Even if he is strong enough to resist it, and is upon his guard against it, the pressure is still there, and its action is still continued, and if at any time he relaxes his vigilance for a moment, he may find himself unconsciously warped by it. I have explained in the 2nd volume of The Inner Life that a man who allows himself to contract a prejudice of this kind on any subject causes a hardening of the matter of the mental body in the part of it through which the oscillations relating to that subject would naturally pass. This acts upon him in 2 ways. First, he is unable to see that subject as it really is, for the vibrations which would otherwise convey an impression of it come against this callosity of the mental body, and either they cannot penetrate it at all, or they are so distorted in their passage through it that they convey no real information. Secondly, the man cannot think truly with regard to that subject, because the very part of this mental body which he would use in such an effort is already so hardened as to be entirely inefficient. So that the only way to overcome the unfairness is to perform a surgical operation upon that wart in the mental body, and excise it altogether, and to keep for a long time a close watch upon it to see that it is not growing again. If that watch be not kept, the steady pressure of the thought waves of thousands of other people will reproduce it, and it will be necessary to perform the operation all over again. Political prejudice. In many parts of the country there is a vast amount of bitter political bias. The majority of the people in a district hold one view or the other, it matters little which, and they find it difficult to imagine that the members of the opposite party are ordinary human beings at all. They are so sure of their own point of view that they appear to think that everyone else must really hold it also, and that it is only out of malice prepense that their opponents are pretending to hold an entirely different view. Yet their own ideas are usually not arrived at by any process of thought or of weighing two lines of policy, but are hereditary, precisely as are most men's religious opinions. There is so much excitement and unpleasant feeling connected with politics in almost every country that the wisest course for the student of occultism is to have as little as possible to do with the whole matter. Not that, if he happens to reside in a country where he has a vote, he should refuse to use it, as many good people have done, because of the mass of corruption which sometimes surrounds political activity of the lower kind. If there is much that is evil in connection with such affairs, that is all the more reason why every good citizen should use the power that the system has vested in him, however foolish in itself that system may be, in favor of what seems to him the right and noble course. Government. The occult theory of government, of the politics of the state, is preeminently the common-sense view. The management of a country is as much a matter of business as the management of a factory or a school. The country has many points of similarity to a great public school. It exists primarily for the benefit of its people, and the people are put there in order to learn. The head of the country makes whatever regulations he considers necessary to secure its efficiency, and there must be discipline and order and prompt obedience to those regulations, or there can be no progress. The king is the headmaster. His work is to exercise sleepless vigilance over the welfare of the school, to employ all methods in his power to make it the best of schools. Our business is not to criticize him, but to obey him, and loyally to give our heartiest cooperation in carrying out whatever he thinks best for the good of the country as a whole. The business of a government is to govern. The business of its people is to be good, loyal, law-abiding citizens so as to make that task of government easy. A king who thinks of or works for fancied private interests of his own, instead of acting only for his country, is obviously failing to do his work. But remember that any subject who in politics thinks of or works for supposed private interests of his own, and not for the good of the country as a whole, is also equally failing to do his duty as a good citizen. As to the outer form of a government, almost any form can be made to work satisfactorily if the people cooperate loyally and unselfishly, forgetting themselves as units and regarding the country as their unit. But no form of government, however excellent, can be successful and satisfactory if its people are selfish and refractory. Religious prejudice. All that I have said of race prejudice is also true of religious prejudice, which is indeed in many ways even worse than the other. Few men choose their religion. Most people are born into a religion, exactly as they are born into a race, and they have no valid reason for preferring it to any other form of faith. But because it happens to be theirs, they arrogantly assume that it must be better than any other, and despise other people whose karma has led them into a slightly different environment. Precisely because this partiality is thus in the air, and because the ordinary man cannot see the pressure of public opinion, the unfairness steals in upon him unobserved and seems to him quite natural, and indistinguishable from an opinion which he has formed for himself on some reasonable grounds. It is necessary that we should constantly pull ourselves up, and examine our reasons for the opinions we hold. It is so fatally easy to go with the current and to accept other men's ready-made thoughts, instead of thinking for ourselves. Almost everyone does this, so why should not I? That is the feeling of the average man, and yet if we would be just to all, as a student of occultism must be, if we seek to know the truth on all subjects. As a student of occultism should know it, then we must at all costs root out these prejudices, and keep a lynx-like watch against their return. We shall find ourselves in many ways differing from the majority, because the opinions of the majority are often unjust, ill-conceived, unreliable. But that after all we must expect, for we are setting before us a high ideal, which as yet does not appeal to that majority. If we think on all points as it thinks, and act in all ways as it acts, in what way have we raised ourselves above it, and how can we be drawing nearer to our goal? Class prejudice. More insidious still perhaps is the class or caste bias. It is so comforting to feel that we are somehow inherently and generically superior to everybody else that no good feeling or good action can be expected from the other man, because he is a bloated aristocrat or a member of the proletariat. As the case may be. Here again, as with all the other misconceptions, the study of the hidden side of the matter shows us that what is needed is more knowledge and more charity. The occultist sees a prejudice to be a congestion of thought. What is necessary therefore is to stir up the thought, to get to know the people and try to comprehend them, and we shall soon find that fundamentally there is little difference between us and them. That there are classes of egos, that some are older and some are younger, and that some are consequently more ignorant than others, it is impossible to deny, for that is a fact in nature. As has been shown by our study of the order in which different divisions of mankind arrived from the moon chain upon the earth chain. But there is a common humanity which underlies all the classes, and to this we may always appeal with the certainty of obtaining some response. Those who feel sure that they belong to the higher class of egos must prove their nobility by great tolerance and charity towards the less fortunate younger members of the human race. Noblesse oblige, and if they are the nobility they must act accordingly. A prejudice is usually so transparently foolish that when a man has freed himself from it he cannot believe that he ever really felt it. Cannot understand how any of his fellow creatures who have any pretense to reasoning powers can be subject to it. So there is a certain danger that he himself may become intolerant in turn, intolerant of intolerance. The occultist, however, who sees the mighty combined thought form and understands the almost irresistible power, and yet the curious insidiousness of its action, understands very well the difficulty of resisting it, the difficulty even of escaping sufficiently from its thraldom to realize that there is anything to resist. Public standards. Fortunately, this almost irresistible pressure of public opinion is not always wrong. In certain directions it is founded not upon the cumulative ignorance of the race but on its cumulative knowledge, on the experience of generations that have gone before us. Public opinion is undoubtedly in the right when it condemns murder or robbery. And countries in which public opinion has not yet advanced so far as to express itself clearly on these points are universally admitted to be in the rearguard of civilization. There are still in the world communities in which law and order are only beginning to exist, and violence is still the deciding factor in all disputes. But those countries are universally recognized as undesirable places of habitation and as lagging behind the progress of the world. There are other crimes besides robbery and murder which are universally condemned in all civilized countries, and in all these directions the pressure exerted by public opinion is a pressure in the right direction, tending to restrain those erratic spirits who might otherwise think only of their own desires and not at all of the welfare of the community. The occultist, seeing so much more of what is really happening, establishes for himself a far more exacting code of morals than does the ordinary man. Many things which the ordinary man would do, and constantly does do, without thinking twice about them, the occultist would not permit himself to do under any consideration, because he sees their effects in other worlds, which are hidden from the less developed man. This is a general rule, though here and there we meet with exceptions in which the occultist, who understands the case, will take steps which the ordinary man would fear to take. This is because his action is based upon knowledge, because he sees what he is doing, while the other man is acting only according to custom. The great laws of morality are universal, but temporary and local customs are often only ridiculous. There are still many people to whom it is a heinous crime to go for a walk on a Sunday or to play a game of cards. At such restrictions the occultist smiles, though he is careful not to hurt the feelings of those to whom such quaint and unnatural regulations seem matters of primary importance. In many cases, too, the superior knowledge gained by occult study enables him to see the real meaning of regulations which are misunderstood by others. Caste prejudice. A good example of this is to be seen in regard to the caste regulations of India. These were established some 10,000 years ago by the Manu in charge of the fifth root race, when he had moved down the main stock of that race from Central Asia to the plains of India. This was after the subraces had been sent out to do their colonizing work, and the remnant of the main stock of his race was but small as compared to the teeming millions of Hindustan. Wave after wave of immigration had swept into the country, and mingled freely with the ruling race among its previous inhabitants, and he saw that, unless some definite command was given, the Aryan type, which had been established with so much trouble, would run great risk of being entirely lost. He therefore issued instructions that a certain division of his people should be made, and that the members of the three great types which he thus set apart should remain as they were. That they should not intermarry with one another or with the subject races. This was the only restriction that was laid upon them. Yet this very simple and harmless regulation has been expanded into a system of iron rigidity which at the present time interferes at every step and in every direction with the progress of India as a nation. The command not to intermarry has been distorted into an order to hold no fellowship with the members of another caste, not to eat with them, not to accept food from them. Not only that, but the great race divisions made by the Manu have been again divided and subdivided until we are now in the presence of not three castes but a great multitude of subcastes, all looking down upon one another. All foreign to one another, all restricted from intermarrying or from eating together. And all this in spite of the fact, well known to all, that within the written laws of Manu, though they contain much which the Manu himself certainly did not say, it is stated quite definitely that the man of higher caste may eat with one of the lowest caste whom he knows to be living in a rational and cleanly manner. And that in the Mahabharata caste is declared to depend not upon birth but upon character. For example, 1's own plowman, an old friend of the family, 1's own cowherd, 1's own servant, 1's own barber, and whosoever else may come for refuge and offer service from the hands of all such Shudras may food be taken. Manusmriti, 4:253. After doubt and debate, the gods decided that the food gift of the money-lending Shudra who was generous of heart was equal in quality to the food gift of the Shrotriya Brahmana who knew all the Vedas, but was small of heart. But the Lord of all creatures came to them and said, Make ye not that equal which is unequal. The food gift of that Shudra is purified by the generous heart, while that of the Shrotriya Brahmana is befolded wholly by the lack of goodwill. Manusmriti, 4:224-225. Not birth, nor sacraments, nor study, nor ancestry, can decide whether a person is twice born, and to which of the three types of the twice born he belongs. Character and conduct only can decide. Mahabharata, Vanaparvan, XII, 108. Yet obvious as all this is, and well known as are the texts to which I have referred, there are yet thousands of otherwise intelligent people to whom the regulations made, not by religion but by custom only, are rules as strict as that of any savage with his taboo. All readily agree as to the absurdity of the taboo imposed in a savage tribe, whose members believe that to touch a certain body or to mention a certain name will bring down upon them the wrath of their deity. Yet all do not realize that the extraordinary taboo which many otherwise sensible Christians erect round one of the days of the week is in every respect as utterly irrational. Nor do our Indian friends realize that they have erected a taboo, exactly similar and quite as unreasonable, about a whole race of their fellow men, whom they actually label as untouchable, and treat as though they were scarcely human beings at all. Each race or religion is ready enough to ridicule the superstitions of others, and yet fails to comprehend the fact that it has equally foolish superstitions itself. These very superstitions have done irreparable harm to the cause of religion, for naturally enough those who oppose the religious idea fasten upon these weak points and emphasize and exaggerate them out of all proportion, averring that religion is synonymous with superstition. Whereas the truth is that there is a great body of truth which is common to all the religions, which is entirely unmarred by superstition, and of the greatest value to the world, as is clearly proved by Mrs. Besant's Universal Textbook of Religion and Morals. This body of teaching is the important part of every religion, and if the professors of all these faiths could be induced to recognize that, and we will not say to abandon their private superstitions, but at least to recognize them as not binding upon any but themselves, there would be no difficulty whatever in arriving at a perfect agreement. Each person has an inalienable right to believe what he chooses, however foolish it may appear to others. But he can under no circumstances have any possible right to endeavor to force his particular delusion upon those others, or to persecute them in any way for declining to accept it. The duty of freedom. It therefore becomes the duty of every student of occultism to examine carefully the religious belief of his country and his period, in order that he may decide for himself what of it is based upon reason and what is merely a superstitious accretion. Most men never make any such effort at discrimination, for they cannot shake themselves free from the influence of the great crowd of thought forms which constitute public opinion. And because of those they never really see the truth at all, nor even know of its existence, being satisfied to accept instead of it this gigantic thought form. For the occultist the first necessity is to attain a clear and unprejudiced view of everything, to see it as it is, and not as a number of other people suppose it to be. In order to secure this clearness of vision, unceasing vigilance is necessary. For the pressure of the great hovering thought cloud upon us is by no means relaxed because we have once detected and defied its influence. Its pressure is ever present, and quite unconsciously we shall find ourselves yielding to it in all sorts of minor matters, even though we keep ourselves clear from it with regard to the greater points. We were born under its pressure, just as we were born under the pressure of the atmosphere, and we are just as unconscious of one as of the other. As we have never seen anything except through its distorted medium, we find a great difficulty in learning to see clearly, and even in recognizing the truth when we finally come face to face with it. But at least it will gradually help us in our search for truth to know of this hidden side of public opinion, so that we may be on our guard against its constant and insidious pressure. Business methods. For example, this public opinion is at a very low level with regard to what are called business methods. In these days of keen competition, things are done and methods are adopted in business that would have astonished our forefathers. Many of these actions and methods are perfectly legitimate, and mean nothing more than the application of shrewder thought and greater cleverness to the work which has to be done. But unquestionably the boundary of what is legitimate and honorable is not infrequently overstepped, and means are employed to which the honest merchant of an earlier age would never have descended. Indeed, there has come to be a sort of tacit understanding that business has a morality of its own, and that ordinary standards of integrity are not to be applied to it. A man at the head of a large mercantile house once said to me, "If I tried to do business according to the golden rule, do unto others as ye would that they should do unto you, I should simply starve, I should be bankrupt in a month." The form in which it runs in business matters is much nearer to that immortalized by David Harum, "Do unto the other man as he would like to do unto you, and do it first." And many others to whom this remark was quoted frankly agreed with him. Men who in all other respects are good and honest and honorable feel themselves bound in such matters to do as others do. Business is business, they say, and the moralist who objects does not know its conditions, and under this excuse they treat one another in business as they would never dream of treating a friend in private life, and make statements which they know to be false, even though outside of their trade they may be truthful men. All our virtues need widening out so that they will cover a greater area. At first man is frankly selfish, and takes care only of himself. Then he widens his circle of affection, and loves his family in addition to himself. Later on he extends a modified form of affection to his neighbors and his tribe, so that he will no longer rob them, though he is quite willing to join with them in robbing some other tribe or nation. Even thousands of years ago, if a dispute arose within a family, the head of the family would act as arbitrator and settle it. We have now extended this as far as our neighbors or our fellow citizens in the same state. If we have a dispute with any of them, a magistrate acts as an arbitrator, in the name of the law of the land. But we have not yet reached a sufficient state of civilization to apply the same idea to national quarrels, though we are just beginning to talk about doing so. And one or two of the most advanced nations have already settled some difficulties in this way. In the same way the brothers of a family stand together, in dealing with one another they will not take advantage or state what is untrue. But we have not yet reached the level on which they will be equally honest and open with those outside of the family, in what they call business. Perhaps if a man meets another in private life or at a friend's house, and enters into conversation with him, he would scorn to tell him a falsehood. Yet let the same man enter his shop or place of business, and his ideas of what is honorable or lawful for him at once undergo a sad deterioration. Undoubtedly, people who manage their affairs along the lines of sharp practice sometimes acquire large fortunes thereby, and those who regard life superficially, envy them for what they consider their success. But those who have accustomed themselves to look a little deeper into the underlying realities, recognize that it is not success at all, that in truth there has been no profit in such a transaction, but a very serious loss. If man is a soul in process of evolution towards perfection, temporarily stationed here on earth in order to learn certain lessons and to achieve a certain stage of his progress, it is obvious that the only thing that matters is to learn those lessons and to make that progress. If man be in truth, as many of us know he is, a soul that lives forever, the true interest of the man is the interest of that soul, not of the body, which is nothing but its temporary vesture. And anything that hinders the progress of that soul is emphatically a bad thing for the man, no matter how advantageous it may appear for his body. The soul is acting through and advancing by means of his vehicles, and the physical body is only one of these, and that the lowest. Manifestly, therefore, before we are able to pronounce whether any course of action is really good or bad for us, we must know how it affects all of these vehicles, and not only one of them. Suppose that one man overreaches another in some transaction, and boasts blatantly of his success and the profit which it has brought him. The student of the inner side of nature will tell him that there has been in reality no gain, but a heavy loss instead. The trickster chinks his money in his hand, and in his short-sightedness triumphantly cries, "See, here is the best of proof. Here are the golden sovereigns that I have won, how can you say that I have not gained?" The occultist will reply that the gold may do him a little good or a little harm, according to the way in which he uses it. But that a consideration of far greater importance is the effect of the transaction upon higher levels. Let us put aside altogether, for the moment, the injury done to the victim of the fraud, though, since humanity is truly a vast brotherhood, that is a factor by no means to be ignored. But let us restrict ourselves now exclusively to the selfish aspect of the action, and see what harm the dishonest merchant has done to himself. The results of deceit. Two facts stand out prominently to clairvoyant sight. First, the deceiver has had to think out his scheme of imposture, he has made a mental effort, and the result of that effort is a thought form. Because the thought which gave it birth was guileful and ill-intentioned, that thought form is one which cramps and sears the mental body, hindering its growth and intensifying its lower vibrations, a disaster in itself far more than counterbalancing anything whatever that could possibly happen in the physical world. But that is not all. Secondly, this duplicity has set up a habit in the mental body. It is represented therein by a certain type of vibration, and since this vibration has been set strongly in motion it has created a tendency towards its own repetition. Next time the man's thoughts turn towards any commercial transaction, it will be a little easier than before for him to adopt some knavish plan, a little more difficult than before for him to be manly, open and honest. So that this one act of double-dealing may have produced results in the mental body which it will take years of patient striving to eliminate. Clearly, therefore, even from the most selfish point of view, the speculation has been a bad one. The loss enormously outweighs the gain. This is a certainty, a matter not of sentiment or imagination, but of fact, and it is only because so many are still blind to the wider life, that all men do not at once see this. But even those of us whose sight is not yet open to higher worlds, should be capable of bringing logic and common sense to bear upon what our seers tell us, sufficiently at least to comprehend that these things must be so. And to take timely warning, to realize that a transaction may appear to be profitable in one direction and yet be a ruinous loss in another, and that all the factors must be taken into account before the question of profit or loss is decided. It is clear that a student of the occult who has to engage in business must needs watch closely what are called business methods, lest the pressure of public opinion on this matter should lead him to perform or to condone actions not perfectly straightforward or consistent with true brotherhood. Prejudice against persons. This applies also in the case of public opinion about a particular person. There is an old proverb which says, give a dog a bad name and you may as well hang him at once. The truth which it expresses in so homely a manner is a real one, for if the community has a bad opinion of any given person, however utterly unfounded that opinion may be, the thought form of it exists in the atmosphere of the place. And any stranger who comes will be likely to be influenced by it. The newcomer, knowing nothing of the victim of evil report, is unlikely to begin his acquaintance with him by charging him with specific crimes. But he may find himself predisposed to think ill of him, without being able to account for it, and may have a tendency to place a sinister interpretation upon the simplest of his actions. If we are trying to follow the truth, we must be on our guard against these influences also. We must learn to judge for ourselves in such cases and not to accept a ready-made public judgment, which is just as truly a superstition as though it were connected with religious subjects. The influence of friends. An influence which often bears a very large part in a man's life is that of his friends. This is recognized in a popular proverb which says that a man may be known by his friends. I take that to mean that the man usually chooses his friends from men of a certain type or a certain class, and that in turn means that he finds himself in sympathy with the ideas of that type or that class. And so is likely to reproduce them himself. But it also means much more than this. When a man is with a friend whom he loves, he is in the most receptive attitude. He throws himself open to the influence of his friend, and whatever characteristics are strongly developed in that friend will tend to produce themselves in him also. Even in the physical world, the belief of a friend commends itself to us merely because it is belief. It comes to us with a recommendation which assures for it our most favorable consideration. The hidden side of this is in truth merely an extension of the idea to a higher level. We open ourselves out towards our friends, and in doing so put ourselves in a condition of sympathetic vibration with them. We receive and enfold their thought waves. Whatever is definite in them cannot but impress itself upon our higher bodies, and these undulations come to us enwrapped in those of affection. An appeal is made to our feelings, and therefore to a certain extent our judgment is for the time less alert. On the one side, this may imply a certain danger that an influence may be accepted without sufficient consideration. On the other hand, it has its advantage in securing for that opinion a thoroughly sympathetic reception and examination. The path of wisdom will be to receive every new opinion as sympathetically as though it came from our best friend, and yet to scrutinize it as carefully as though it had reached us from a hostile source. Popular superstitions. It must be remembered that superstition is by no means confined to religious matters. Most traveled Englishmen are aware that in certain parts of the continent there exists a very decided superstition against the admission of fresh air into a room or a railway carriage. Even though science teaches us that fresh air is a necessity of life. We know without a shadow of doubt, from scientific teaching, that sunlight destroys many disease germs, and vitalizes the atmosphere. So it is impossible to question that it ought to be admitted to our houses as freely as possible, more especially in those unfortunate countries where we see so little of it. Yet instead of accepting this blessing and exulting in it, many a housewife makes determined efforts to shut it out when it appears, because of a superstition connected with the colors of curtains and carpets. It is not to be denied that sunlight causes certain colors to fade. But the curious lack of proportion of the ignorant mind is shown in the fact that faded colors are regarded as of greater importance than the physical health and cleanliness which the admission of the sunlight brings. Civilization is gradually spreading, but there are still many towns and villages in which the superstitious following of the customs of our unscientific forefathers prevents the adoption of modern methods of sanitation. Even among people who think themselves advanced, curious little fragments of primeval superstition still survive. There are still many among us who will not commence a new undertaking on a Friday, nor form one of a party of 13. There are many who regard certain days of the week or of the month as fortunate for them and others as unfortunate, and allow their lives to be governed accordingly. I am not prepared to deny that a larger number of instances than could reasonably be accounted for by coincidence can be adduced to show that certain numbers are always connected in some way with the destiny of certain persons or families. I do not yet fully understand all that is involved in this, but it would be silly to deny the fact because we have not immediately at hand an adequate explanation of it. Those who are interested in pursuing this question further will find some of the instances to which I am referring in the appendix to Baring Gould's Curious Myths of the Middle Ages. I do not doubt the existence of what are commonly called planetary influences, for I have already explained the hidden side of them. But I say that, while these influences may make it easier or more difficult to do a certain thing on a certain day, there is nothing whatever in any of them, or all of them combined, that can prevent a man of determined will from ordering his life precisely as he thinks best. As has been said, the wise man rules his stars, the fool obeys them. To let oneself become a slave to such influences is to make a superstition of them. The fear of gossip. Perhaps the greatest and most disastrous of all the taboos that we erect for ourselves is the fear of what our neighbors will say. There are many men and women who appear to live only in order that they may be talked about. At least that is what one must infer from the way in which they bring everything to this as to a touchstone. The one and only criterion which they apply with regard to any course of action is the impression which it will make upon their neighbors. They never ask themselves, is it right or wrong for me to do this, but, what will Mrs. Jones say if I do this? This is perhaps the most terrible form of slavery under which a human being can suffer, and yet to obtain freedom from it, it is only necessary to assert it. What other people say can make to us only such difference as we ourselves choose to allow it to make. We have but to realize within ourselves that it does not in the least matter what anybody says, and at once we are perfectly free. This is a lesson which the occultist must learn at an early stage of his progress. He lives upon a higher level, and he can allow himself to be influenced only by higher considerations. He takes into account the hidden side of things of which most people know nothing. And, basing his judgment upon that, he decides for himself what is right and what is wrong, and, having decided, he troubles himself no more as to what other people say of him than we trouble ourselves as to the flies that circle round our heads. It never matters in the least to us what anyone else says, but it matters much to us what we ourselves say. A better aspect. Happily this mighty power of thought can be used for good as well as for evil, and, in some ways, the pressure of public opinion is occasionally on the side of truth and righteousness. Public opinion, after all, represents the opinion of the majority, and therefore the pressure which it exercises is all to the good when it is applied to those who are below the level of the majority. It is indeed only the existence of this mass of opinion which renders social and civilized life possible, otherwise we should be at the mercy of the strongest and the most unscrupulous among us. But the student of occultism is trying to raise himself to a level much above the majority, and for that purpose it is necessary that he should learn to think for himself, and not to accept ready-made opinions without examining them. This much at least may be said, that, if public opinion does not yet exact a very high level of conduct, at least the public ideal is a high one, and it never fails to respond to the noble and the heroic when that is put before it. Class feeling and esprit de corps do harm when they lead men to despise others, but they do good when they establish a standard below which the man feels that he cannot fall. In England we have a way of attributing our morals to our religion, whereas the truth seems to be that there is little real connection between them. It must be admitted that large numbers of the cultured classes in almost any European country have no real effective belief in religion at all. Perhaps to a certain extent they take a few general dogmas for granted, because they have never really thought about them or weighed them in their minds. But it would be an error to suppose that religious considerations direct their actions or bear any large part in their life. They are, however, greatly influenced, and influenced always for good, by another body of ideas which is equally intangible, the sense of honor. The gentleman in every race has a code of honor of his own. There are certain things which he must not do, which he cannot do because he is a gentleman. To do any of those things would lower him in his own estimation, would destroy his feeling of self-respect. But in fact he has never even the temptation to do them, because he regards them as impossible for him. To tell an untruth, to do a mean or dishonorable action, to be disrespectful to a lady. These and such as these, he will tell you, are things which are not done in his rank of life. The pressure of such class feeling as this is all to the good, and is by all means to be encouraged. The same thing is to be found in a minor degree in the tradition of our great schools or colleges, and many a boy who has been strongly tempted to escape from some difficulty by an act of dishonor has said to himself, "I cannot do that. For the sake of the old school." It shall never be said that one of its members descended to such an action. So there is a good side as well as a bad one to this matter of public opinion, and our business is to use always the great virtue of discrimination, so that we may separate the desirable from the undesirable. Another point worth remembering is that this great, clumsy, stupid force of public opinion can itself be slowly and gradually molded and influenced. We ourselves are members of the public, and under the universal law our views must to some extent affect others. The wonderful change, which during the last 30 years has come over modern thought in connection with the subjects which we study, is largely due to the persistent work of our society. Through all those years we have steadily continued to speak, to write, and above all to think sanely and rationally about these questions. In doing so we have been pouring out vibrations, and their effect is plainly visible in a great modification of the thought of our day. Only those men who are fully ready can be brought as far as theosophy, but thousands more may be brought halfway into new thought, into spiritualism, into liberal Christianity. In this case, as in every other, to know the law is to be able to wield its forces. Chapter 11. By occasional events. A funeral. So far we have been considering chiefly the influences which, whether emanating from nature or from humanity around us, are steadily exercising upon us a fairly constant pressure, of which we are usually ignorant precisely because it is constant. It will now be well to mention the hidden side of such occurrences as come only occasionally into our lives, as, for example, when we attend a funeral, when we undergo a surgical operation, when we attend a lecture, a political meeting, or a spiritualistic séance, when there is a religious revival in our neighborhood, when a great national festival is celebrated, or when there is a war, an earthquake, an eruption or some great calamity in the world. First, then, how is a man affected by the hidden side of a funeral? I do not mean how is a man affected by his own funeral, though that also is a question of interest, for it affects some people to an extraordinary extent. No person of philosophical temperament would trouble himself as to what was done with his body, which is after all only a worn-out garment. But there are many people in the world who are not philosophical, and to them it is sometimes a matter of great moment. All classical history assures us that the ancient Greek, when he died, was exceedingly anxious that his body should receive what he considered decent sepulture, mainly because he labored under the illusion that unless this was done he would not be free to pursue the even tenor of his way after death. Most of the ghost stories of ancient Greece related to people who came back to arrange for the due disposal of their bodies. The poorer classes among the modern Irish seem to share this extraordinary anxiety about the disposal of their bodies. For on several occasions I have come across Irish women whose one thought after death was not in the least for the welfare or progress of their souls, but that the number of carriages following their funeral procession should not fall below a certain number, or that the coffin provided for the body should not be in any respect inferior to that which Mrs. So-and-so had had a few weeks before. This, however, is a mere digression, and what we have to consider is the effect of a funeral upon the survivors, and not upon the dead man, who, nevertheless, is usually present, and regards the proceedings from various points of view, according to his temperament. A funeral is distinctly a function to be avoided by the occultist, but sometimes he may find himself in circumstances where his refusal to attend might be misconstrued by ignorant and uncomprehending relations. In such a case he should exert his will, and put himself into a determined and positive attitude, so that he may on no account be affected by the influences around him, and at the same time be in a position powerfully to affect others. He should think first of the dead man, who will most likely be present, with strong, friendly interest and affection, and with a determined will for his peace and advancement. He should adopt also a positive attitude of mind in his thought towards the mourners, endeavoring strongly to impress upon them that they must not grieve, because the man whom they mourn as dead is in reality still living, and their grief will hinder him in his new condition. He must try mentally to hold them firmly in hand, and to prevent them from relaxing into hysterics and helplessness. The modern funeral is far from ideal. It seems to be an established convention that there must be some kind of ceremony connected with the disposal of the discarded clothing of the liberated ego, but surely something better might be devised than what is usually done at present. The funeral in the village church is not without a certain amount of appropriateness, even a certain consolation. The mourners are in a building which has for them holy and elevating associations of all sorts, and the service appointed by the Church of England is beautiful. Though here and there one would like to infuse into it a note of more enthusiastic certainty. But for the service performed in a cemetery chapel there is nothing whatever to be said. The place is never used for any other purpose than a funeral, and its whole atmosphere is pervaded with hopeless grief. Everything is usually as bare and as gloomy as possible, the very walls reek of the charnel house. We must remember that, for one person who understands the truth about death and takes an intelligently hopeful view of it, there are hundreds who have nothing but the most irrational and gruesome ideas. Such a place as that, therefore, is filled with the blackest despair and the most poignant mental suffering. And it is consequently of all places the most undesirable into which to take those who have experienced what seems to them to be a bereavement. The disposal of the dead body. No one who has the faintest glimpse of the hidden side of things can approve of our present barbarous method of disposing of the bodies of the dead. Even on the physical earth there is no single point in its favor, and there are many weighty considerations against it. From the sentimental point of view alone, it is impossible to understand how any person can reconcile himself to the idea that the cast-off garment of one whom he loves should be left to a slow and loathsome decay under conditions from which imagination shrinks with horror. And when to this we add the dreadful danger of disease to the living from the unspeakable pollution of air and of water, we begin to understand that our funeral customs are one of the many indications that our boasted civilization is, after all, only a veneer. Still more decidedly is this impression confirmed when we gain an insight into that side of these matters which is as yet unknown to the majority. We become aware then what kind of entity it is that is attracted by the process of slow putrefaction, and we see that in this way also terrible, unnecessary harm is being done to the survivors. For the dead man, if he is wise, it matters little what becomes of the worn-out garment. But it should be remembered that all dead men are not necessarily wise, and that for some of them, who know no better, this abominable custom of ours makes possible a serious mistake, which under proper conditions could not be committed. The average man in his ordinary thinking is not in the habit of separating himself into body and soul as definitely as does the student of occultism. True, the dead man has finally left his physical vehicle, and it is practically impossible for him again to take possession of it, but he is intimately acquainted with it, and its rates of vibration are familiar and sympathetic to him. Under all normal and clean and proper conditions he has done with it entirely. But there are those who, having had no ideas, no conceptions of any sort beyond the physical during life, become crazy with fear when they find themselves altogether cut adrift from it. Such men sometimes make frantic efforts to return into some sort of touch with physical life. Most do not succeed, but when any of them do succeed to some limited extent, it can be only by means of their own physical bodies. Such rapport as they still retain with the decaying vestures sometimes enables them to draw from them the basis of an imperfect and unnatural half-materialization, not nearly enough to bring them back into touch with the physical world, but yet sufficient to tear them for the time from healthy astral life. Such people make for themselves for a while, fortunately only for a while, a dim, grey world of horror in which they see physical happenings as in a glass darkly, as through a world of mist in which they wander, lost and helpless. They cannot get back entirely into the dense bodies. A man who did would become a vampire. But they do get hold of the etheric matter of their discarded vehicles, and drag it about with them, and this is the cause of all their suffering. And until they can get rid of this entanglement, until they can plunge through the grayness and get into the light, there can be no rest for them. There are unpleasant forms of black magic, too, known in Oriental countries and to those who have studied the methods of the voodoo or the obeah, which depend for their success upon the decaying physical body. Though this is happily not a consideration of practical importance to those who live among communities unversed in such evil lore. But at least this is clear, that all possibilities of evil, both for the dead and for the living, are avoided by the rational disposal of the discarded vesture of flesh. When we return to the custom of cremation, practiced by the Hindus, the Greeks and the Romans, we reduce the physical vehicle as rapidly as possible to its constituent elements in a manner which is at once clean, decent, and wholly satisfactory to the aesthetic sentiment as well as to the rational view of the man of sense. Some people have feared the possibility that, especially in the cases of sudden death, the dead man might feel the flame, might be in some way not yet fully separated from his body, and so might suffer when that body was burned. Even if the death be sudden, so long as it is death, the astral and etheric matter have been completely separated from the denser physical. And it would be quite impossible that the dead man could under any circumstances feel what was done to the physical body. I mean that he could not really feel it, because the connection through which he feels is definitely broken. What is perhaps possible is that, seeing the cremation, he might have a certain fear lest he should feel it, the idea that he ought to be feeling it, as it were, and so imagination might come into play to some extent. I have never seen such a case in connection with cremation, but I remember hearing on good authority of a young man whose teeth were all drawn after his death by a dishonest undertaker, in order that they might be sold as artificial teeth. The young man appeared to his father with blood flowing from his mouth, exclaiming in great indignation that they had tortured him by drawing his teeth. The body was exhumed, and it was found that his story was correct. In this case, if the man was really dead, it is quite impossible that he could have felt any pain, but he became aware of what was being done, and was very angry about it. And no doubt he may have thought of himself as really injured, because during life the idea of tooth drawing had been associated with great pain. The difference which the knowledge of the hidden side of things makes in the consideration of the whole subject of death is very aptly shown by two of the figures reproduced in the book on thought forms, those which illustrate the thought images. Created by two men standing side by side at a funeral. There it is seen that the man who had lived in the ordinary blank ignorance with regard to death, had no thought in connection with it but selfish fear and depression. Whereas the man who understood the facts was entirely free from any suggestion of those feelings, for the only sentiments evoked in him were those of sympathy and affection for the mourners, and of devotion and high aspiration. Indeed, knowledge of the hidden side of life entirely changes a man's attitude towards death, for it shows him instantly that instead of being the end of all things, as is often ignorantly supposed, it is simply the passage from this stage of life to another which is freer and pleasanter than the physical, and that consequently it is to be desired rather than to be feared. He sees at once how utterly a delusion is the theory that those who cast aside their physical bodies are lost to us, for he knows that they remain near us just as before, and that all that we have lost is the power to see them. To the consciousness of the man who possesses even astral sight, the so-called dead are just as definitely present as the so-called living, and since he sees how readily they are affected by the vibrations which we send out to them, he understands how harmful is the attitude of mourning and grief so often unfortunately adopted by the friends who still retain their physical bodies. A knowledge of the hidden side of life by no means teaches us to forget our dead, but it makes us exceedingly careful as to how we think of them. It warns us that we must adopt a resolutely unselfish attitude, that we must forget all about ourselves, and the pain of the apparent separation, and think of them neither with grief nor with longing, but always with strong affectionate wishes for their happiness and their progress. The clairvoyant sees exactly in what manner such wishes affect them, and at once perceives the truth which underlies the teaching of the Catholic Church with regard to the advisability of prayers for the dead. By these both the living and the dead are helped. For the former, instead of being thrown back upon his grief with a hopeless feeling that now he can do nothing, since there is a great gulf between himself and his loved one, is encouraged to turn his affectionate thought into definite action which promotes the happiness and advancement of him who has passed from his sight in the physical world. Of all this and much more I have written fully in the book called The Other Side of Death, so here I will only thus far touch upon the subject and refer to that volume any who wish for more detailed information. A surgical operation. In these days of the triumph of surgery, it not infrequently happens that a man has to submit himself to an operation. There is less of a hidden side to this than to many other events, because the use of anesthetics drives the man away from his physical body altogether. But in that very absence much that is of interest to him takes place, and it is well to endeavor to note and remember as far as may be what occurs. This is a difficult thing to do. More difficult than the bringing through of the memory from the astral world, because what is driven out by the anesthetic is the etheric part of the physical man, and as the etheric double is only a portion of the physical body, and in no sense a perfect vehicle in itself, a man cannot usually bring through a clear memory. I remember a case of this nature which I was asked by the victim to attend. He was much interested in the occult side of the affair, and anxious to remember all that he could. He was placed upon the operating table, and the anesthetic was administered. Almost immediately the man sprang out in his astral body, recognized me, and started down the room towards me with an expression of vivid delight upon his face, evidently overjoyed at finding himself fully conscious in the astral world. But in a moment came pouring forth from the physical body a great cloud of etheric matter which was forced out by the anesthetic. This cloud immediately wrapped itself round him, and I could see the intelligence fade out of his face until it became a mere mask. When I was permitted to see him again 2 days afterwards, his memory of what had happened tallied exactly with that I had seen. He remembered the rush out of his body. He recollected clearly seeing me at the other end of the room, and feeling greatly delighted that everything seemed so real. Then he started down the room towards me, but somehow he never arrived, and knew nothing more until he came back into the body an hour later when the whole operation was over. I felt on that occasion what an advantage the possession of clairvoyance would have been to the 2 doctors engaged. They gave the patient too much of the anesthetic, and came within an ace of finally driving out the whole of his etheric double, instead of only part of it as they intended. As my clairvoyant companion forcibly remarked, they left hardly enough of it to cover half a crown, and the consequence was that the patient came perilously near to death. And they had to pump oxygen into his lungs for 10 minutes in order to bring him back to life at all. A few years ago a visit to the dentist frequently meant a minor operation, in which the patient passed through a somewhat similar but much shorter experience, owing to the administration of nitrous oxide. And many curious phenomena have shown themselves in connection with that. An example in point will be found in my book on dreams, page 38. In these days of local anesthetics the dentist is usually able to do his work without the administration of gas, and consequently the experiences connected with his operation are of a less occult nature. A lecture. We have in a previous chapter considered the consequences which attend upon the action of going to church. Let us now consider the inner side of attending a lecture, a political meeting, a spiritualistic séance, or a religious revival. Of these forms of excitement the lecture is usually the mildest, though even that to some extent depends upon its subject. There is generally much less uniformity about the audience at a lecture than about a congregation in a church. There are often many and rather decisive points of likeness between those who adopt the same religious belief, whereas the people who are interested in a lecture upon some particular subject may come from many different folds, and be of all sorts of quite different types. Still, for the time being there is a link between them, the link of interest in a particular subject, and therefore, however different their minds may be, the same portion of the mind is for the moment being brought into activity in all of them. And that creates a certain superficial harmony. Since the theosophical student frequently has to deliver lectures as well as to endure them, it is perhaps well not entirely to neglect that side of the subject, but to note that if the lecturer wishes to act effectively upon the mind-bodies of his audience, he must first of all have a clearly defined idea expressing itself through his own mind-body. As he thinks earnestly of the different parts of his subject and tries to put them before his people, he is making a series of thought forms, unusually strong thought forms because of the effort. He has a fine opportunity, because his audience is necessarily to a great extent in a receptive condition. They have taken the trouble to come in order to hear about this particular subject, and therefore we must suppose that they are in a condition of readiness to hear. If under these favorable conditions he fails to make them understand him, it must be because his own thought upon the subject is not sufficiently clear-cut. A clumsy and indefinite thought form makes but a slight impression, and even that with much difficulty. A clearly cut one forces the mental bodies in the audience to try to reproduce it. Their reflections of it will almost invariably be less definite and less satisfactory than it is, but still, if its edges are sharp enough, they will convey the idea to some extent. But if that from which they have to copy is itself blurred, it is eminently probable that the reproductions will prove entirely unrecognizable. Sometimes the lecturer receives unexpected assistance. The fact that he is engaged in thinking strongly of one particular subject attracts the attention of disembodied entities who happen to be interested in that subject. And the audience often includes a greater number of people in astral than in physical bodies. Many of these come simply to hear, as do their brothers in the physical world, but sometimes it happens that one of those who are attracted knows more about the subject than the lecturer. In that case he sometimes assists by suggestions or illustrations. These may come to the lecturer in various ways. If he is clairvoyant he may see his assistant, and the new ideas or illustrations will be materialized in subtler matter before him. If he is not clairvoyant, it will probably be necessary for the helper to impress the ideas upon his brain, and in such a case he may well suppose them to be his own. Sometimes the assistant is not disembodied, or rather only temporarily disembodied, for this is one of the pieces of work frequently taken in hand by the invisible helpers. In some cases the ego of the lecturer manifests himself in some curious exterior way. For example, I have heard the greatest orator now living say that, while she is speaking one sentence of a lecture, she habitually sees the next sentence actually materialize in the air before her, in 3 different forms, from which she consciously selects that one which she thinks the best. This must be the work of the ego, though it is a little difficult to see why he takes that method of communication, since after all it is he who is delivering the lecture through the physical organs. At first blush it seems that it would be as easy for him or perhaps even easier to select a form himself and impress only that one upon lower matter. And even then it might as well come directly to the brain as be materialized in the air before it. Returning from the lecturer to his audience, we may note that it is possible for his hearers to give him great assistance in his work. Older members of a branch have sometimes been heard to say that they did not feel it necessary to go down to the lodge meeting on a certain occasion, as the lecture was about a subject with which they were already thoroughly acquainted. Apart from the large assumption involved in the statement that one can ever be fully acquainted with any theosophical teaching, it is not accurate to say that a man's presence is useless because he knows the subject. Exactly the opposite remark would have much more truth in it. Because he knows the subject thoroughly he also can make strong and clear thought forms of the different illustrations required, and in that way he can greatly assist the lecturer in impressing on the audience what he wishes to convey to them. The greater the number of people present at a lecture who thoroughly understand its subject, the easier will it be for all those to whom it is new to obtain a clear conception of it. The lecturer, therefore, is distinctly helped by the presence of those who can fully comprehend him. He also may be much helped or hindered by the general attitude of his audience. In the main that is usually friendly, since the majority of people who come to a lecture come because they are interested in the subject and wish to learn something about it. Sometimes, however, 1 or 2 appear whose main desire is to criticize, and their presence is anything but helpful. A political meeting. This latter effect is much more in evidence at a political meeting, for there it seems to be the rule that, while some people go for the purpose of supporting the speaker, others go merely for the purpose of challenging and interrupting him. Consequently the feelings to be experienced, and the thought forms to be seen, at political meetings are not easy to predict beforehand. But one often sees cases in which forms composed entirely or principally of the thoughts of the adherents of one party make huge waves of enthusiasm, which rush over the audience, surround the speaker and work him up into a corresponding condition of enthusiasm. Many years ago I remember attending a meeting of this description, and being much struck by the effect produced by getting all the people to join together in singing. Some great gun of the party was to speak, and consequently the huge hall was crowded to suffocation a couple of hours before the advertised time. But the organizers of the meeting were wise in their generation, and they employed that time most efficiently by working up that vast heterogeneous crowd into a condition of loyal enthusiasm. All sorts of patriotic songs followed one another in quick succession, and though few really knew the tunes, and still fewer the words, there was at least no lack of enthusiastic good feeling. The 2 hours of waiting passed like an entertainment, and I think most people were surprised to find how quickly time had fled. The occult side of the average political meeting, however, is far from attractive, for from the astral world it not unfrequently bears a strong general resemblance to an exceedingly violent thunderstorm. There is often much warring feeling, and even a good deal of personal enmity. On the whole we have usually a preponderance of a sort of rough and perhaps rather coarse, good-humored jollity, often pierced, however, by spears of anxious feeling from the promoters. Unless duty actually calls one to such gatherings it is generally better to avoid them, for on such occasions there is always a clash of astral currents that cannot but induce great fatigue in anyone who is in the least sensitive. Crowds. It is also desirable to avoid as far as possible the mixing of magnetism which comes from too close contact with a promiscuous crowd. Not that we must assume for a moment that the persons composing the crowd are necessarily lower or worse than ourselves. It would be most undesirable that the student should become self-conscious, self-conceited or self-righteous. It is probably true that the aims and objects of the majority of people in any crowd, taken at random, are of more worldly type than those of the theosophical student, but it would be both wrong and foolish to despise the people on that account. The point to bear in mind is, not that we are better than they, but that there is a difference in the rates of vibration, and that consequently to be in constant contact with others causes disturbance in the various vehicles, which it is better to avoid. Nevertheless, when duty renders it necessary or desirable that the student should enter a crowd, there are at his disposal various means by which he can protect himself. The most usual is the making of a shell, either etheric, astral or mental. But the best protection of all is a radiant goodwill and purity. I shall presently devote a chapter to the consideration of this question of protection. A séance. Of all forms of meeting one of the most interesting from the occult point of view is the spiritualistic séance. Though of this there are so many different types that hardly anything can be said which would apply equally to all of them except perhaps that one almost invariable characteristic is an atmosphere of joyousness and hopefulness. The circles to which outsiders are often introduced, those of which we hear and of which we may occasionally read in the newspapers, these are after all the few, and behind them, forming the real block of spiritualism, are two other variants of which we hear very little. There is the ordinary séance, quite among the poor, with a medium probably of the stout washerwoman type, where no sensational phenomena take place, where the spirits are frequently ungrammatical. Thousands of such séances are being held all over the world, and there is a strong family likeness between them. To a visitor their proceedings would appear profoundly uninteresting. Usually the medium gives a kind of fourth-rate ethical address, or perhaps it is really given through the medium, but in any case it usually faithfully reproduces all her favorite errors in grammar and in pronunciation. Then as a general rule a few words are said specially to each of the persons present, often taking the form of a description of their surroundings or of the spirits which are supposed to be hovering about them. Such descriptions are usually vague and uncertain to the last degree, but now and again striking identifications are made, far too many to be explicable on any theory of mere coincidence. And however dull all this may seem to the outsider, it does undoubtedly carry peace and conviction to the members of the circle, and gives them a real living knowledge and certainty with regard to the continued existence of man after death, which puts to shame the faith of the fashionable churches. The hidden side of a séance such as this has often something pathetic about it. Behind the medium there is usually what is called a spirit guide, a dead person, sometimes of the medium's own class in life. Sometimes of a decidedly higher type, a dead person who has by much patient effort learned how to influence with a reasonable amount of certainty the clumsy organism of the medium, which, however unsuitable it may be in most other respects, at least possesses the invaluable faculty that it can be influenced and that communications can in some way or other be got through. The patience with which this entity deals with the poor souls that come to him from both sides of the veil is admirable. For he has to try to bring into harmony not only the tearful inconsequence of scores of sorrowing relations on this side, but also the feverish and clamorous excitement of a crowd who are trying to rush into manifestation from the other. With his class and in his way such an entity does a great deal of good. And his life of unnoticed toil in some obscure district adds more to the sum total of human happiness than many far more showy efforts which receive greater credit in the eyes of the public. Even such a séance as this, when examined with astral sight, is seen to be a center of a kind of vortex. The departed rushing in from all directions, desiring either themselves to manifest or to watch the manifestation. There is another variety of séance of which few know anything, the private family circle to which no outsider is ever admitted. This is infinitely the most satisfactory side of spiritualism, for through it many thousands of families communicate day by day with friends or relations who have passed from the physical world. And in this way not only learn a number of interesting facts but are kept constantly in touch with spiritual subjects and at a high level of thought with regard to them. Most commonly the central figure at these private séances is some departed member of the family, and the communications ordinarily are affectionate little sermonettes of a devotional character, often somewhat rhapsodical. Occasionally, however, where the departed relation happens to be a man of original thought or of a scientific turn of mind, a great volume of definite information is gradually gathered together. There are far more of these private revelations in existence than is generally suspected, for hardly 1 in 100 of those who receive them is prepared to face an exposure to public ridicule of what to him is above all things a holy thing. In the hope of so improbable a result as the conversion of some skeptical stranger. At such séances as these, remarkable phenomena are not infrequent, and materializations of the most startling kind are sometimes part of the daily program. Often the so-called dead are just as much part of the daily life of the family as the living, as was the case, for example, with the phenomena which took place at the house of Mr. Morel Theobald, at Hazelmere. The séances described by Mr. Robert Dale Owen are largely of this character, and they represent the highest possible kind of spiritualism, though in the very nature of the case it is hardly ever available to the ordinary inquirer. The hidden side of such séances as these is truly magnificent, for they form points of habitual contact between the astral and physical worlds, vortices again, but this time only of the higher and nobler varieties of astral life. The thought forms surrounding them are of the religious or the scientific type according to the nature of the manifestations, but they are always good thought forms, calculated to raise the mental or spiritual level of the district in which they are to be found. Putting aside these two large classes, we have next the smaller group of public séances which to most outsiders represent the whole of spiritualism. All sorts of people are admitted to these, usually, on payment of a small sum of money, and the entities who appear on the astral side are just as curious a conglomerate as those who attend on the physical. Here also there is almost always a spirit guide in charge. The highest astral types are not to be found among the habitués of such séances as these, but there is usually a sprinkling of dead people who have devoted themselves to the idea of being useful to those still on the physical earth, by the exhibition of phenomena and the giving of various small tests. The aura of such a séance is usually on the whole somewhat unpleasant, for it attracts a great deal of attention in the astral world as well as in the physical. And consequently round every one of them is always a clamorous crowd of the most undesirable entities, who are restrained only by force from pushing in and seizing upon the medium. Among the dangers attending these séances is the possibility that one of these desperate creatures may seize upon any sensitive sitter and obsess him, worse still, that he may follow him home, and seize upon his wife or daughter. There have been many such cases, and usually it is almost impossible to get rid of an entity which has thus obsessed the body of a living human being. The hidden side of such a séance is generally a confused network of cross-currents, some good and some bad, but none very good and some very bad. The clairvoyant attending such a séance may obtain a certain amount of instruction from watching the various methods by which the phenomena are produced, which are sometimes exceedingly ingenious. He will be astonished at the cleverness of the personations, and at the amazing facility with which those who know nothing of this side of life can be deceived. A religious revival. From the point of view of the student of the inner worlds, one of the most remarkable phenomena of our day is what is called a religious revival. A religious revival, as seen from the physical world, usually means a gathering of people of the lower classes whose feelings are inflamed by highly emotional and often lurid appeals from some fanatical exponent of the gospel of a particular sect. Day after day these meetings take place, and they are often accompanied by the most extraordinary phenomena of nervous excitement. People work themselves up into some sort of hysterical condition in which they feel themselves to be saved, as they call it, to have escaped forever from the bondage of the ordinary life of the world, and to have become members of a spiritual community whose aims are of the highest description. Often they are moved to confess in public what they consider to have been their misdeeds, and they are apt to do this with a wealth of emotion and repentance entirely out of proportion to anything that they have to confess. The wave of nervous excitement spreads like an infectious disease, and usually it lasts for some weeks. Though often towards the end of that time symptoms of universal exhaustion appear and the whole thing somewhat shamefacedly dies down into commonplace life again. In a small percentage of the cases the spiritual elevation appears to be maintained, and the victims continue to live a life at a distinctly higher level than that which had been theirs previously. But by far the greater number of the cases relapse either suddenly and dramatically, or by slow and gradual stages, into much the same kind of life as they had led before the excitement came. Statistics show that the culmination of this emotional excitement is accompanied by great sexual disturbance, and that the number of illegitimate unions of all sorts is temporarily greatly increased. There are certain sects which take as part of their regular system a much modified form of this excitement, and consider it necessary for their junior members to pass through a crisis which is sometimes described as being convinced of sin, and in other cases simply as getting religion. Such a revival as this is seen in its most extravagant form among the Negroes of America, among whom it reaches a level of frenzy not commonly attained by the white races. The Negroes find it necessary to relieve their feelings by dances and leaps and contortions of the wildest kind, and these are often carried on for hours together, accompanied by yells and groans of a truly alarming character. That this sort of thing should take place in the 20th century, and among people who think themselves civilized is surely a most remarkable phenomenon, and one deserving careful consideration from a student of the inner side of things. For one who possesses astral vision such an outburst is a wonderful but unpleasant sight. The missioner or revivalist preacher who first commences such a movement is usually animated by the highest motives. He becomes impressed with the overflowing love of God, or with the wickedness of a particular section of the community, and he feels that the Spirit moves him to proclaim the one and to rebuke the other. He works himself up into a condition of tremendous emotional excitement, and sets his astral body swinging far beyond the degree of safety. For a man may yield himself to emotion up to a certain point, and yet recover himself, just as a ship may roll to a certain extent and yet swing back again to her normal position. But just as the ship capsizes if she rolls beyond that point of safety, so if the man lets his astral body entirely escape from control, he dies, or becomes insane or is obsessed. Such an obsession need not necessarily be what we should call an evil one, though the truth is that all obsession is evil. But I mean that we need not credit the obsessing entity with anything but good intentions. Though he usually takes advantage of such an opportunity more for the sake of the excitement and the feeling which he himself gets out of it than from any altruistic motive. In many cases, however, the obsessing entity is a departed preacher of the same religion, style and type as the man obsessed, and thus we have temporarily two souls working through one body. The double force thus gained is poured out recklessly upon any audience that can be gathered together. The tremendous swinging energy of these hysterical excesses is contagious, and since such revivals are usually set on foot among people whose emotions are not under the control of a strongly developed intellect, the preacher soon finds others who can be reduced by sympathetic vibration to a condition as unbalanced as his own. Everyone who swings over the safety point adds to the strength of these exaggerated vibrations, and soon an astral disturbance is set up of the nature of a gigantic whirlpool. Towards this from all sides pour astral entities whose one desire is for sensation, no longer merely or even chiefly human beings, but all kinds of nature spirits who delight in and bathe in the vibrations of wild excitement just as children play in the surf. It is they who supply and constantly reinforce the energy which is expended with such terrible recklessness. It is they who try to keep up the level of the excitement, so long as they can find any human beings who can be dragged into the vortex and induced to give them the pleasurable sensations which they desire. The emotion, remember, is emphatically not of a high type, for it is intensely personal. It is always motived by an exalted egoism, the desire to save one's own soul, so that the dominant idea is a selfish one. That defines the kind of matter which is set in motion in these tremendous swirlings, and that again limits the nature spirits who enjoy it to such types as find themselves in tune with that kind of matter. These are naturally by no means the highest types, they are usually creatures without much intelligence or comprehension, understanding nothing about their human victims, and quite unable to save them from the consequences of their mad excitement, even if they could be supposed to care to do so. This then is the hidden side of such a movement. This is what the clairvoyant sees when he watches one of these most astonishing meetings. He sees a number of human beings who are taken out of themselves, whose higher vehicles are for the time being no longer their own, but are being used to supply this torrent of energy. All these people are pouring out their emotions in order to make a vast astral whirlpool into which these great nature spirits throw themselves with intense delight, plunging and flying through it again and again in wild abandonment of utter pleasure. For they can abandon themselves to pleasure with a thoroughness of which the heavier human being knows nothing. Their whole life for the time is one wild paroxysm, and this feeling reacts upon the human beings who unconsciously minister to their pleasures, and gives them also a sensation of intense exultation. Here we see the explanation of the passional side of these extraordinary displays. All that the nature spirits desire is intense emotion of one kind or other on the part of their human slaves. It is nothing to them whether that emotion be religious or sexual, probably they do not even know the difference. Certainly they cannot know whether either is helpful or harmful to the evolution of the human beings concerned. The whole thing is a wild, mad orgy of non-human entities, precisely the same thing as the medieval witches' Sabbath, but provoked in this case by an emotion which many consider as belonging to the good side instead of to the evil side of life. But to these nature spirits all that makes no difference. They know nothing of good or evil. What they enjoy is the tremendous excitement which they can gain only by swaying masses of human beings simultaneously into a condition imminently dangerous to the sanity of their victims. No one man alone could reach so dangerous a level of excitement. There must be a great number reacting upon and, as it were, encouraging and strengthening one another. Indeed, I should advise the student not to attend revival meetings, because, unless he is in good health and well poised, there is definite danger that even he may be swept off his feet. I wish it to be distinctly understood that in what I have written I am in no way denying the great fact that what is called sudden conversion does sometimes take place, and that the man to whom it happens is ever after the better for it. The word conversion is a noble one, if we can only dissociate it from such undignified surroundings as those that I have been describing. It means, to turn along with, and its implication is that the man, who has hitherto been working along his own selfish road, realizes for the first time the mighty truth that God has a plan for man, and that it is within his power to adapt himself intelligently to this plan and fulfill the part in it which is destined for him. When he realizes this, he turns round and goes together with the divine will, instead of ignorantly working against it. And after he has once done this, although he may become what the Christians call a backslider, although his vehicles may run away with him, and carry him into all sorts of excesses, he can never again sin without feeling remorse, without knowing that he has fallen, and regretting the fall. This knowledge of the great facts of life is called in the East, the acquirement of discrimination, or sometimes, the opening of the doors of the mind. Usually it is a gradual process, or at least one which comes as the result of continual thought or reasoning. Sometimes, however, the final conviction is borne in upon the man in an instant, and that is a case of what is called sudden conversion. If the man to whom that instantaneous flash of conviction comes has previously reasoned a thing out with himself, perhaps in other lives, and has almost persuaded himself, so that he needs merely a final touch of illumination to make him quite certain, then the effect of such a conversion is permanent. Not that, even then, the man may not frequently fall back, but he will always recover from such falls, and will on the whole make steady progress. As has been described, the emotional effect of a great revival meeting is very powerful. Not only will it give the little additional touch which is needed for the conversion of a man who is nearly ready for that process, but it will sometimes seize upon a man who is as yet by no means ready. And it may be powerful enough to swing him over the dividing line, and make him profess himself for the moment, and quite honestly, as heartily converted as the other. But the permanent effect is by no means the same. In this latter case, the man is not really ready. There is a vast amount of force still uncontrolled in the lower part of his nature, and although that was for the time dominated by the forces present at the revival meeting, when that is over it reasserts itself. And the man inevitably falls back again into his former courses. We must not blame him for that. The strength which is needed for the permanent control of the lower nature grows very slowly, and it would be unreasonable to expect that it can ever be developed in a moment of enthusiasm. The cases in which it appears to be so developed are simply those in which the force has been secretly gathering itself for a long time previously. Therefore I say again that I do not for a moment deny the occasional reality of sudden conversions. I do not deny that a certain amount of good must follow from all the devotional enthusiasm which is thrown into a religious revival. But I also say that every word that I have written above as to the general effect of such gatherings, and the part taken in them by non-human entities, is absolutely true. And for that reason I cannot but think that such excitement should be avoided by the student of occultism. In the rare cases where a vast crowd is moved by a dominant idea which is wholly unselfish, quite a different order of entities comes into play, the astral angels, who have an active delight in good. Under such guidance as theirs, the excessive temporary vibration is safe and even helpful, for these beings understand humanity and know how to bring it back again safely into its ordinary condition. Some years ago I happened to see a remarkable instance of this which I will presently describe, but I must first say a few words as to the virtue which caused the outburst. For the whole difference is in the motive. In the case previously described it was fundamentally selfish, but in this it was unselfish, in that it was the hope of personal salvation, in this it was loyalty and patriotism. A wave of patriotism. Patriotism is a virtue upon which in these days it is very necessary to insist. But we must be sure of what we mean by the term. It is not prejudice, nor is it ill-mannered boasting. There are those who can see no good in any country but their own, who are constantly vaunting with offensive swagger what they consider its superlative excellencies, and disparaging all others. These are not patriots, but mere braggarts. They exhibit not the strength of their loyalty, but the depth of their ignorance. True patriotism is the very antithesis of all this. It recognizes that each country has its advantages and its disadvantages, that each nation has its excellencies, but also always its deficiencies, since no political or social scheme is yet perfect. And there is a good deal of human nature everywhere. Nevertheless it also sees that just as man owes consideration to the parents who have tended him and to the family of which he finds himself a part, so does he also owe something to the country into which he is born. For that birth is not a matter of chance but of karma. He is put there because these are the surroundings that he has deserved, and they are also those best suited to help onward his evolution. He is put there not to receive only, but to give, for man learns best by service. Thus he should be prepared when called upon to work for his country. He should acquiesce cheerfully in such measures as may be necessary for the general good, even though they may bring loss to him individually. He should forget for his country's sake his private interests and desires, and when the opportunity arises he should give himself unsparingly to her service. I am aware that, among students of what is called advanced thought, there are those who sneer at patriotism as a virtue which is half a vice, as an evidence of a low stage of development. But that is a mistaken view, as well might one rail at family affection for exactly the same reasons. Truly both love for family and love for country are more limited than universal love, but they are nevertheless stages on the way to it. If primitive man thinks only for himself, it is an advance for him to extend his love to that wider self which we call the family, and to learn to feel and to think for his nation is but a further step on the same road. Later still he will learn to think and to feel for humanity as a whole, and then he will come to see that the animal and the plant are our brothers, even though they may be younger brothers, and that all life is the divine life. And so the love which was once confined to himself, to his family, to his clan, to his nation, has become wide as the shoreless sea of the divine love. But a very necessary stage on the way to this goal is that patriotism which leads a man to forego his own ease and comfort, to put aside his private opportunities of gain, nay, to sacrifice his very life, in order to serve his country. Naturally also he personifies his country in the person of her ruler, and so is developed the other virtue of loyalty, and his character is thereby greatly elevated and purified. That individual kings have in the past often been unworthy of this high feeling is a sad fact, but it does not interfere with the other fact of the benefit which accrues to those in whom such feeling is evoked. When it fortunately happens that the sovereign is all that a ruler should be, we have a collocation of circumstances in which loyalty can work with its greatest effect, and splendid results may be achieved both for the king and his people. A remarkable instance of this was seen in the enthusiasm evoked by the celebration of the Diamond Jubilee of the late Queen Victoria. For those who could see it, the inner side of the proceedings of that day was a spectacle never to be forgotten. It happened that on that occasion I had, through the kindness of a friend, a seat at one of the office windows in the city on the route of the great procession. Even from the physical point of view, the decorations had transformed the gloomy London streets. The whole of the fronts of the tall houses on both sides of the dingy street were covered with a sort of scaffolding which formed temporary balconies to each of the windows, and all these were closely packed with men, women and children. So that the grim house fronts were like cliffs lined with faces, rising tier above tier, and the procession wound its way at the foot, as along a gorge whose sides were built of human bodies. Mostly the people were business men with their wives and families, and country friends. And these latter introduced an element of gaiety and curiosity to which those stern, dark city streets are unaccustomed, for as a rule the people gave themselves up to the enjoyment of the occasion, and to the criticizing of their neighbors' toilets. The city men themselves were in the majority of cases unable to shake off their anxieties, and were to be seen still surrounded by thought forms of prices and percentages. Occasionally a privileged carriage would dash by, or a regiment of soldiers on its way to take part in the pageant. But those rarely claimed more than a moment's attention from these business men, who collapsed almost immediately into their calculations again. Even when at last the great procession itself appeared, their interest in it was but half-hearted, and they saw it against a background of stocks and shares and financial anxiety. Now and again some specially popular visitor received a little ovation, but on the whole the astral appearance of that huge crowd differed little at that period from that of other similar gatherings. The delight of the children at so unusual a holiday showed itself in many a flash and coruscation of color, while their fathers' thoughts frequently offered the unfavorable contrast of dark and leaden patches. Blots upon the variegated brilliancy of the scene, for they were but little affected by the waves of excitement which were beginning to leap across from side to side of the street. But the vibration of feeling grew stronger and stronger, and when the splendor of that marvelous pageant culminated in the approach of the Queen herself, a startling change took place. For all the thousands of little local flashes and vortices of color disappeared utterly, overwhelmed in the tremendous cataract of mingled blue and rose and violet, which was pouring like a veritable Niagara down both sides of that living valley of faces. Literally the only comparison possible for it was that smooth, resistless rush which is so impressive as one looks up from below at the greatest waterfall of the world. But here it was combined with a wealth of indescribably glorious color far beyond any conception on the physical plane. No words can give any idea of the effect of that tremendous outburst of simultaneous enthusiasm, that coruscating cascade of love and loyalty and veneration, all converging upon the carriage in which the royal lady sat, unrestrainedly weeping in sympathy with the overflowing emotion of her subjects. Yes, and her subjects wept also, wept for pure joy and depth of feeling, and those hard-headed businessmen forgot their calculations and their anxieties, forgot themselves and their sordid financial considerations utterly for the time. And were transported into a higher world, lifted clear out of themselves, up to a plane of thought and feeling which many of them had not touched since early days of innocent childhood. An unique experience, not easily to be had in prosaic times like these, but a most salutary one, which could not but leave a beneficial impression upon everyone who passed through it. That strong soul-shaking was transient, no doubt, yet every heart had for the moment been stirred to its profoundest depths by noble, unselfish emotion, and every heart was the better for it. A similar and even more splendid exhibition of unselfish emotion has taken place recently at the coronation of His Majesty King George V. I had not myself the privilege of seeing that in the physical body. But an account from those clairvoyants who did see it shows that it must have surpassed even that other demonstration. War. Another occasional event, happily very occasional and growing rarer and rarer, which profoundly stirs the hearts of the people, is war. Now I suppose that few at the present day would venture to deny that war is an absurd and atrocious anachronism. If we pause for a moment to think, we all know perfectly well that the result of a battle does not in the least decide the original question at issue. It may show which army has the cleverest general or the greatest weight of artillery. It certainly does not show which side is in the right in the quarrel, if there be any right. So far as individuals are concerned, all except the very lowest classes have passed beyond the stage of attempting to decide personal disputes by ordeal of battle. When our convictions as to a boundary line differ pronouncedly from our neighbor S, we no longer assemble our servants and try to argue the matter with rifles or bludgeons. But we refer the case instead to a tribunal in whose impartiality we both have reasonable confidence. As nations, however, we are not yet at the level of evolution which we have reached as individuals. We are willing, some of us, to submit comparatively unimportant matters of dispute to arbitration, but there is as yet no court in which the races of the world have sufficient trust to accept its decision in a question vital to their existence. So the irrational appeal to brute force still remains as a possibility hovering ever in the background of national life like a menacing thundercloud. Poets have sung of the glories of war, but the legions of the Red Cross, who go forth not to hurt but to help, who come upon the battlefield after the rifle and the cannon have done their work, these can tell us something of the true meaning of war, and of all the ghastly horrors involved in the gallant defense or the successful charge. War may still be sometimes a necessity, the lesser of two evils, but it is so only because our boasted civilization is still lamentably deficient. Yet, horrible and senseless though it be, it is capable in a certain way of utilization. It has its part to play at an early stage of evolution. Unquestionably the egos incarnated in the Zulu hordes, that did not hesitate to march to certain death at the command of Shaka or Sitweo, acquired in that way qualities of obedience, self-control and self-sacrifice which will be valuable to them in later births amid surroundings where they can be put to more rational use. And it is to the Zulu level of development that war properly belongs. The same lessons, however, are needed by many who obtain birth in higher races than the Zulu. And without abating one jot of our horror of the ghastly cruelty and senselessness of war, we may yet admit that such devotion to the abstract idea of patriotism as will lead a man to be ready to die for it, means a distinct advance upon the normal attitude of the class from which our common soldiers are chiefly drawn. Those who are closely acquainted with our agricultural population cannot have failed also to observe the difference which military or naval training makes in the young man, how, from being slow of speech and comprehension, he becomes alert, dexterous, resourceful and self-respecting. Unfortunately he sometimes picks up other and less desirable habits at the same time, but at least he is less bovine and more human. There is, however, no reason why an excellent system of physical training should not be universally adopted even when peace reigns supreme, so that we might gain all the benefit which is at present derived by those who are trained in the army and navy, without the sinful and ridiculous waste of life and money in actual warfare. A step in this direction is already being taken by the admirable organization called the Boy Scouts, and it is fervently to be hoped that this may spread over the whole world, so that its benefits may be shared by all. Terrible and wicked though it be, war, when it does occur, that is, when it cannot longer be prevented, is always utilized and turned to at least some sort of compensatory good by the authorities who stand behind. It is sometimes employed also as an alternative to something still worse, or a smaller war is permitted in order to avoid a more disastrous one. I have been told that if the war which England recently waged in South Africa had not taken place, a colossal and terrible European war would have been inevitable, which would have involved far more widespread destruction. It is also certain that that war was utilized to bind more closely together the different parts of the British Empire, so that in standing side by side upon the battlefield men might learn to become more brotherly and to understand one another better. Indeed, that is an effect which has often followed upon war, that the factions within a country have agreed to forget their differences in the face of the common enemy. The attack of Italy upon Tripoli may or may not be in the abstract justifiable. But no one who has lived in the country can doubt that it has had its value in bringing the somewhat heterogeneous population of Italy into a closer unity than ever before, into a realization of its solidarity as a nation. The hidden side of the actual fighting is perhaps less remarkable than might be expected. The sound forms produced by the discharge of artillery and by the ceaseless rattling of the rifles are naturally of a striking nature, but as far as the astral world is concerned, a surging mass of confusion is the principal characteristic in the neighborhood of the battlefield. There is inevitably a certain amount of fear coming from those who are new to the ghastly work, but there is usually comparatively little of actual hatred. The pain and grief of the wounded are terrible enough, yet even then there is in most cases little of hatred or personality. There is generally a strong sense of order, obedience, determination, coming perhaps principally from the officers and the older soldiers. But unless the spectator senses the thought forms of the generals, it is difficult to get any coherent idea of the scene as a whole. Many invisible helpers are brought together during a battle, to receive the dead and extend to them any assistance of which they may be in need. But, taking it as a whole, there is far more feeling excited about war in the minds of countrymen and relations than in those of the soldiers themselves who actually take part in it. Catastrophes. Sometimes great catastrophes other than war overtake the world. 200,000 people perished suddenly in an earthquake at Messina. What is the occult side of such a happening as that? The inner sight helps us to look more understandingly on such events as this, and while we pity the sufferers no less, we yet avoid the feeling of overwhelming horror and dismay which paralyzes many at the thought of such an occurrence. Let us think calmly, analytically, what really happened in that case. 200,000 people were suddenly released from the burden of the flesh. Surely we have no need to pity them. We cannot speak of them as sufferers, for they have been lifted suddenly and painlessly into a higher and happier life, and in such a catastrophe as this there is really less of suffering than in connection with many isolated cases of death. The suffering caused by sudden death is never to the dead man, but to the relations who, not understanding the facts of death, suppose themselves to have lost him. But precisely in a great catastrophe of this nature, few are left to mourn for the others, since the families within a certain area are almost all destroyed. The direct relations in most cases die together, and those who are left to mourn are more distant relations settled in faraway districts. Some there were beyond doubt who suffered terribly, men who were wounded and left for days awaiting succor. Others who were shut in beneath heaps of ruins and suffocated or starved to death. Towards these indeed our keenest sympathy may well go forth. Yet remember that they can have been at most but few, a smaller number than those who die of starvation every week in our capital city of London, for starvation is not merely absolute lack of food for a certain number of days. A man who has insufficient food, or bad food containing insufficient nourishment, for a period of years, is starving to death quite as surely as the man who for a few days has no food at all. And there is far more prolonged suffering in the former case than in the latter. But again, it may be said, in the earthquake there was a vast amount of suffering, because many people were rendered homeless, and because they were bereft of their ordinary supplies of food. That again is true, and to those also our heartiest sympathy must be extended. Indeed, we know that the whole world did so extend it. And from the occult view, by far the most important effect of that earthquake was the great wave of sympathy and pity which came rolling in upon the place from every part of the habitable globe to which the news had been carried. It is not death which we should regard as an evil fate, our theosophical knowledge has at least taught us that. It is never the dead whom we should pity, but the living who still suffer under all the cramping restrictions of this strange physical plane. For those whose consciousness knows no other world, it seems terrible to have to quit this. A man whose sight ranges over the higher worlds knows, with a vivid certainty that nothing can shake, that, if one is to consider happiness alone, the happiest moment for every man is that in which he escapes from this world into the wider and more real life above. Granted that our life here is a necessity, that we have development to make which can be made only under these hard conditions. It is for that reason that our physical life is necessary, and so we come forth into it as a man goes forth from his home to some unpleasant task which nevertheless he knows must be done. Pity by all means the poor fellow who is exiled from that higher life, but do not waste your sorrow upon those who have gone home again to the glory, the beauty and the rest. Seen from the physical world everything is distorted, because we see only so tiny a part of it, and then with strange stupidity insist upon taking that for the whole. Occultism teaches us a finer proportion, and brings our life into perspective for us, and so, while we lack nothing of sympathy for all who suffer, we yet learn that those who most need our sympathy are not those upon whom the undiscerning world showers it most freely. All worlds alike are part of the great solar deity. In him, we live and move and have our being, and since we cannot fall away from his presence nor escape his guiding hand, what matters all the rest? Chapter 12. By unseen beings. Sensitive people. The occasional events to which we have hitherto referred have been such as might come into the life of almost anyone. There is another class of occasional events which usually come only to a certain type of people, but upon those people they exercise an influence so great that it cannot readily be measured, great enough often to alter the whole current of a life. There are those among us who are more sensitive than the majority of men, who dream dreams and see visions, and to these people their visions are the most important fact of life. Naturally also, such people are attracted to the study of occultism, so that the proportion of them among our readers is likely to be far greater than in the world which cares for none of these things. To these visions also there is a hidden side, one which it is of great importance to study. Visions are of many kinds, some trivial and unimportant, others profoundly interesting and productive of far-reaching effects to those who experience them. In some cases their genesis is obvious, in others curious and unexpected associations play their part, and a number of quite separate causes may combine to produce what seems to be a single story. As I have written several books upon the conditions of the astral world, it not unfrequently happens that persons who have had psychic experiences or visions which they have not fully comprehended send me accounts of them and ask me whether my experience along these lines suggests any explanation. Such letters are not always easy to answer, not that there is usually any difficulty in formulating a hypothesis which will fit the facts, but because there are too many such hypotheses. Almost every experience described might equally easily have been produced in any one of half a dozen ways. And without undertaking a special and detailed investigation it is often impossible to say which of these methods was employed in a particular case. Naturally, but few of the hundreds of cases submitted are of sufficient general interest to warrant such expenditure of time and force. But occasionally one is encountered which is specially characteristic, so good an example of its type that an analysis of it might conceivably be of use to many others to whom similar experiences have come. A remarkable case. Such an one came to me recently from a lady, an account of a long and complicated vision or series of visions, coupled with impressive experiences, which had left behind them a permanent result. In order to understand what had really happened a certain amount of investigation was necessary, in course of which it became evident that several distinct factors had come into play to produce the curious effects described. Each of these factors had to be followed up separately and traced to its source. And I think that students can hardly fail to be interested in an examination of the way in which these independent and disconnected causes work to bring forth a somewhat startling whole. I give here an epitome of the story as sent to me, using in many cases the exact words of the narrator, but condensing as much as I can without losing the spirit and style of the original. It should be premised that the lady had become dissatisfied with the religious doctrines of her childhood, and had commenced the study of comparative religion, reading several theosophical books, among others The Secret Doctrine. She was very earnestly desirous to know the truth and to make whatever progress might be possible for her. In the course of her reading she came across Swami Vivekananda's book on Raja Yoga, and practiced the breathing exercises therein recommended. The result was that she rapidly developed a certain kind of clairvoyance and began to write automatically. For some 5 days she indulged her astral controls, writing all day long whatever they wished. It seems that she was strongly opposed to the idea of capital punishment, and had felt great sympathy and pity for a murderer who had recently been executed in her neighborhood. Among other entities this dead murderer came and communicated, and brought with him other men of the same stamp. She made the most earnest efforts to help these people, trying in every way to give them hope and comfort and to teach them as much of theosophy as she knew. She soon found, however, that the murderer dominated and obsessed her, and that she was unable to eject him. Her case became rapidly worse, and her life and reason hung in the balance. For a long time no suggestion, no effort, mitigated her sufferings, though she prayed continually with all the power of her soul. At last one day she became conscious of the presence of another being who brought her relief. He told her that the prayer of her spirit had been recognized, that he had been appointed as her guide, and that because of her spiritual development and the power which she had shown in prayer, she was considered especially hopeful and was about to be the recipient of most unusual favors. In fact, he said so much about her remarkable position and the recognition which she had gained, that she asked wonderingly, "Who then am I?" "You are Buddha," was the startling reply. "And who are you?" she asked. "I am the Christ," he answered, "and I will now take charge of you." Our correspondent here showed her common sense and her great superiority over the majority of those who receive such communications by absolutely refusing to believe these astonishing statements. But she nevertheless accepted the guidance, and the teaching upon other points, of the entity who made these astounding claims. He then told her that she was to pass through an initiation, and that if she succeeded she would be admitted to the Council of Heaven, which had been called together to decide whether the world should now be destroyed, or whether yet another effort for its salvation should be made. He urged her to hasten to qualify herself to attend this meeting while the fate of the world still hung in the balance, so that she might give her voice in favor of salvation. Her attitude of mind was rather curious. She certainly did not accept these extravagant claims, but still she half believed that there was some great work to be done. And she was willing to continue the experiment and submit herself to the guidance of the entity who had saved her from obsession. As a preliminary to the initiation she was directed to have a bed put into a room where she could lock the door, to lie down upon it and make herself comfortable. The guide then instructed her to breathe the yoga breath as taught by Vivekananda. He told her that her previous efforts had raised the serpent fire to the solar plexus, and that now she must raise it to the brain, a process in which he would help and direct her. She describes the sensations which followed as exactly resembling the travail of a woman in labor, except that the pain was along the spine, and it seemed that the birth was to take place in the brain. Many times her sufferings were so excruciating that she grew desperate and was about to abandon the struggle, but the guide seemed most anxious and always implored her not to yield, but to carry through the ordeal to the end. He hovered over her like an attendant physician or nurse, encouraging, directing, helping, doing everything that he could to assist the birth. At last she prevailed, and she asserts that the birth appeared to her just as definite and real a thing as that of one of her own children. When it had taken place the guide was greatly relieved, and exclaimed, "Thank God it is over." This extraordinary experience was, however, only the prelude to a long series of marvelous visions, lasting altogether through 12 days of our physical time. These visions were partly of a directly personal character, and partly of the nature of general instruction, often incoherent and indescribable, yet always interesting and impressive. The personal part consisted of her relation with the so-called Council of Heaven, and the result of her dealings with it. And also included some curious symbolical visions in which persons well known to her in physical life seemed to play the part of the world which she was trying to save and of the archenemy Satan, a fallen angel who resisted her. She pertinently remarks that this was all the more strange since for many years she had quite outgrown any belief in a personal devil or in the necessity of what is ordinarily called salvation. The general instruction was broadly theosophical in its character, and referred chiefly to the stages of creation and the evolution of the various root races. She describes the first stage of this as follows. I then beheld a wonderful vision. At first in the midst of darkness I saw a vast darkness which seemed to brood and brood for ages. Then a slight movement began, as if it might be the faintest dream in this great darkness. Little by little the movement increased, until at last a definite thought seemed to evolve. Little by little constantly changing forms appeared. All was chaos. Even the forms were in the midst of chaos, and the travail of the universe was terrible. All was one. It seemed as if the effort to evolve order and to make of so many forms a unit, demonstrated beyond doubt that all was made by one great being, and that the pain and responsibility were felt by him alone. This continued for a long time, with another expression of birth-giving, with enlarging results and unchanging solemnity. I do not know when I first began to see souls. It must have been early in the wonderful exhibition. For I remember very distinctly how thickly they lay everywhere in the midst of chaos, and in the midst of forms. In the continual vibration of this marvelous evolution these souls were swallowed up in forms, which forms again changed to souls. These souls were egg-shaped and of all sizes, from tiny ones to larger ones, but none so large as I saw later in a wonderful sequel. After a time the panorama of marvels changed and the world assumed a shape familiar to my mode of thought. Symbol upon symbol passed, including all history and mythology. Thousands of pictures passed in review, as if revealing the whole of cosmos and of history. I can recall but few now, but one will serve as an illustration. I saw a cow of immense proportions, almost as large as one of our mountains. A ladder was placed against her, and a man crept slowly and laboriously up the ladder, round by round. He represented humanity. When at last he reached her back, he stretched forward and grasped both her horns. Humanity claimed the products and bounty of the earth for all, not for a few only. My guide called the cow of Demeter. My reading of the classics had taught me that Demeter represented the earth. It was apparently at this stage that she was introduced to the Council of Heaven. She found it to consist of a small number of colossal figures seated in a semicircle. The members seemed impatient with the world and determined that it should be destroyed, but she begged most earnestly that another chance should be given to humanity, saying that she had lived and died many times for the world, and was quite ready to devote herself once more to its service. Her guide told her afterwards that she had no idea in the physical world how eloquent she had been in her pleadings on that occasion. There seems to have been some difference of opinion in the council, but eventually the majority yielded to her prayer, and promised to send help to her and to her guide in order that they might work for the world. An examination into the truth lying behind this remarkable vision of the Council of Heaven was one of the most interesting features of the investigation, of which I shall write later. After this the semi-theosophical visions were resumed. Once more I quote the words of her letter. That night other visions succeeded, but the story of symbology changed. I saw a valley in which lay the human race, and over it hovered a swarm of beings clad in white, but the whiteness radiated no light. Humanity was dark and shadowed. I rushed to awaken them, but at my approach the white-clad figures rushed into strong, determined and powerful groups to prevent my accomplishing my purpose. I recognized that they were deceiving spirits, self-appointed teachers and preachers of the earth, and that they resolutely beat down and held down the dazed and shadowed humanity. But even as I looked I saw here and there an awakening soul among the human multitude. As this soul awoke it grew luminous as with a light from within, and at the same time it arose from its prone position and began to move about over the sleeping world, trying to arouse others. I seemed to stand on a distant mountain, but could distinctly see whenever a soul began to awaken and to shine, and before the vision passed, many of these radiant lights seemed to burst out here and there. And even a golden light of sun rays began to gild the tops of the surrounding mountains, and the white-robed figures fled as this golden radiance increased. They, however, continued to exercise themselves in strenuous endeavors to counteract and oppose my efforts to help the world or to live my life. All night the visions continued, but those towards morning were vague. My guide awoke me and told me to get up and get a cup of coffee and to gather myself together, as I was so much in the spirit as to be about to depart from the body altogether. When I had obeyed I found myself dazed. All the time in which I was endeavoring to make a fire and to prepare the cup of coffee, my guide was present and I was conscious of a most wonderful condition. Angels seemed to surround me and to sing hymns of thanksgiving. It was Thanksgiving morning, and the former inclemency of the weather had given place to balminess. I opened the door and turned my face to the southwest. I felt myself surrounded by supernal beings, and sang with them a wonderful hymn of praise and thanksgiving. It resembled the Assumption of the Virgin Mother, the Immaculate Conception, the birth and presence of the wonderful child at once. A peculiarly refreshing but unfamiliar odor permeated the atmosphere. My guide said that the angels were burning frankincense. Later in the day my guide again told me to go to bed. The vision was most wonderful. Again I beheld creation, but this time it was different. I saw the races in the aggregate. As the races appeared and vanished, my guide said solemnly, "And the evening and the morning were the first day, and the evening and the morning were the second day," etc. Somehow, though I cannot now explain it, although I felt that I understood it at the time, the fifth race was born in the fourth day, and seemed to be of special importance. To that birth my special attention was called, as the full-fledged fifth race man lay stretched on the hands of a great being, and was held out to me to observe. In this vision I saw that, up to the fifth race, mankind was all sorts. Some were large and some were small. Chaos prevailed, and there was little order anywhere in the human universe. But after the birth of the fifth race man I saw that all had become equal and all worked in perfect harmony. I saw also, at this time, that the race took solid form, like a phalanx, the form, however, being circular, and that a band was slipped around the whole mass, passing from man to man, and that no man could get outside of that binding band. The passing of the race was marked by the whole human race being suddenly transformed into the soul form egg-shaped. In the sixth race the development was very marked indeed. The individuals were equal, but much larger than in the fifth race. The tendency of the whole race was much more upward, and the movement had become greatly accelerated. At some time towards the close of the fifth or the beginning of the sixth, I cannot accurately recall just when, I saw sunlight again gilding the peaks. The race emerged from shadow into sunlight, and the onward and upward tendency became swifter and swifter. Then, the hour having once more struck, the eggs lay together just as do the eggs in a nest, but their number was countless. My guide left me here. He said he could not go on with me, that I must go on alone and interpret for myself the meaning of my visions. He warned me to be careful not to give up my life. For upon my going through successfully and not giving up my life would depend my success and the salvation of the world, for which all this that we had seen had been done. In other words, I believed myself to be passing through a terrible ordeal for the salvation of the world. As I beheld the development of the seventh race I seemed to go to unimaginable altitudes indeed. The band that I first saw binding the fifth race was strongly encompassing the sixth and seventh races. It became unbreakable. And as I looked into the faces of the men of the seventh race, I saw that gradually they shone more and more brightly with an inner light. Their radiance no longer came from without, but each was shining, living, dazzling light. My body was now very weary, and when evening came I begged for rest. But this was not given. I was put through many trials. Many were terrible, and it required the utmost exertion of my powers to enable me to endure. What was the nature of this I do not know. I know only that I promised to deliver God's message under any and all conditions, no matter what they might be, if he should require it. But the trials were awful. At one time I refused the visions, though they were becoming more and more beautiful. They then ceased, and I seemed to find myself in the power of Satan. All these orthodox terms I personally had long disclaimed, but they became real again in the visions. For a time I believed that as a punishment for my perverseness, or rather as a result of this mistake, I had lost all. The awful crisis had passed. The world was lost as a result of my failure, and now it seemed to be not only this world, but the universe. How I prayed and struggled then. Before all could be restored, I promised not only to give up my life but the lives of my children and even the very life of my soul, if need be, for the salvation of the world. I cannot linger here. Towards morning a wonderful breath came into my body, going up and down the spine as if there were absolutely no physical obstruction in my body, and as it breathed or flowed through me, it sang a wonderful, divine anthem. And ended in a marvelous union, in which I felt myself fully united with God. That was a condition it were folly to attempt to describe. During this time I beheld a new series of visions, all of glory. There were no forms that I can recall, but glory after glory of color, each brighter and grander than the last. At last it was a wonderful violet, and as it shone upon me in unspeakable glory, I was told that I might go on and see God if I would. I asked if from there I might return, and was told that if I went on I could not return. I then said once more, as I had done in 100 other trials, I must live to save the world. And as I said that and refused to go on, the sun rose in the world, where I was then conscious, and I looked up at my beautiful vision, thinking how dull the sun was, and then gradually the vision faded. Just when, I cannot say, but about this time, I was laid on a cross during the night, placed in a sepulchre, and believed my body was dead. My physical heart, as I thought, was arrested, and the pain which I endured was excruciating. But the bliss of my soul in the higher visions was as great as was the pain in the body in the sacrificial trials. After this I must desist from any effort at description. I really cannot tell the strange things that befell me, nor are they clear in my memory. One of the ideas was that I was put through preparation for the work I was to do, another, I seem to hear, and be a part of, involution as well as evolution. Perhaps it represented the experiences of the soul preparing for incarnation. When at last I came out of it all, I found my sorrow-stricken family around my bed. They had thought that I was dying. From the beginning of my abnormal condition to the final close had been 12 days, and for 5 days and nights I had not slept. On the last day, I had believed myself that after all I was not to live longer in this world, and when I awoke to full and normal consciousness, the voice that I had heard so mysteriously gradually faded away, as did the visions. And neither have appeared to me since. But since then, I have been conscious of a new spiritual life, and in meditation I reach a blissful condition, and I feel sure that some wonderful thing has happened to me. The vision investigated. It must be understood that the extracts given above are only a small part of the visions described by our correspondent, but I think that I have given a fair sample of them. And have not omitted any point of special interest. Anyone who is accustomed to analyze psychic phenomena will at once see that there are in the account several features which differentiate it from the average. Many visions, even though quite elaborate and detailed, and intensely realistic to the seer, prove on examination to be entirely self-created. I mean that a man first thinks out a subject himself along certain lines, thereby creating a series of thought forms. And then he proceeds to pass out of his body in sleep or trance, sees his own thought forms without recognizing them as his, and supposes them to be actualities instead of imperfect reflections. Thus he is strongly confirmed in his particular belief or superstition, whatever it happens to be, because he himself has seen it in a vision which he is sure to regard as celestial. Such a man is of course perfectly honest in his conviction, and even perfectly right in saying that he has seen certain things. The weak point is that he has not the training which would enable him to distinguish the nature of what he has seen. In the case now before us, however, there are various little touches, which are extremely unlikely to have been the thoughts of the seer. And there is considerable evidence that a mind differing much from hers must have been responsible for a great deal of what was seen. As our correspondent was anxious to understand the genesis of her visions, and as their history gave promise of somewhat unusual features, it seemed worth while to make a definite investigation into the matter. A rapport was therefore obtained with the lady, and it was further found necessary to examine the astral and mental records connected with her, and thus ascertain what had really happened to her. It was soon obvious that many distinct factors entered into the matter, and it was only by patiently disentangling the threads and following each one up to its origin that all the causes could be clearly seen. To put the case briefly, the lady, as hundreds of other people have done, had got herself into serious trouble by an unwise use of breathing exercises. Her desperate efforts to escape from the result of these exercises attracted the attention of a dead man who was strong enough to be of some use to her. But this man had objects of his own to gain, objects not consciously selfish, but belonging to a curious personal delusion of his, and as he helped her he realized that he had here what might be a powerful instrument for the furtherance of his plans. He promptly modified his scheme, gave her a prominent part in it, and pushed her on into experiences which without him she would probably not have had for several incarnations yet. Much of what resulted was evidently not at all what he had expected, though he tried bravely to turn it all to account. Eventually he dropped her, partly because he was alarmed at the turn which matters were taking, and partly because he began to see that he could not use her quite as he had hoped. The outcome of the whole adventure, so far as our correspondent is concerned, has been good, but this is a piece of good fortune for which she cannot be too thankful, since the risks were enormous. And by any ordinary calculations there was scarcely the barest possibility that she would escape with her life and with reason unimpaired from such an experience. In order to comprehend all that occurred we must first try to understand what manner of man was this guide, and how he came to be what he was. During physical life he had been a small farmer, a kindly but ignorant man, fanatically religious in a narrow Protestant way. His only literature was the Christian Bible, over which he pored during the long winter evenings until his whole life became saturated with his conception of its teachings. Needless to say, his conceptions were usually misconceptions, often so grossly material as to be ludicrous, yet the man was so thoroughly in earnest that it was impossible to laugh at him. He lived in a thinly populated part of the country, and as he found his few neighbors out of sympathy with his religious views he became more and more a recluse as years rolled by, living frugally on the produce of a small part of his farm, and devoting himself with increasing ardor to the study of his one book. This constant brooding over one idea brought him eventually into a condition of religious monomania, in which he came to believe himself the chosen savior of the world, the Christ who was destined to offer to it once more the opportunity of salvation which 2,000 years ago it had received only very partially. A prominent feature in his scheme was the rescue from its false belief of the vast mass of non-Christian humanity, and his idea was that this should be done not along ordinary missionary lines but through the influence of its own great leaders. It was this part of his program which induced him to take so keen an interest in our correspondent, as we shall see later. While still fully possessed by these religious delusions the worthy farmer died. Naturally enough, his astral life was simply a continuation of the physical, raised as it were to a higher power. He soon found himself amidst the crude thought forms of the Golden Jerusalem, a special corner of which he seems to have modeled for himself to suit his idiosyncrasies. The result of his efforts to visualize the descriptions given in the Apocalypse were sometimes really ingenious and original. I notice specially his image of the 24 elders bowing perpetually in adoration before the throne, and casting at the feet of the deity their golden crowns, which immediately rose from the ground and fluttered back automatically onto their heads, only to be cast down again. His sea of glass mingled with fire was not altogether successful, and looked rather like some unusually weird product of a volcanic eruption. His image of the All-Father was quite conventional, a stern-looking old man with a long white beard. In the earlier part of his physical life he had evidently had a thought image of the Christ, the usual impossible combination of a crucifix and a lamb bearing a flag. But during the later period, when he was persuaded that he himself was the Christ, this figure had not been strengthened, and it was consequently inconspicuous and inactive. It is among these thought forms of his that we have to seek for the counsel of heaven, which plays a part in our correspondent's vision, and the constitution of that counsel proved to be both interesting and instructive. The idea seems originally to have been that the council was a sort of selection of about 10 of the more important biblical characters, Elijah, Moses, Peter, etc. Represented by colossal figures seated in a semicircle on uncomfortable-looking high-backed golden chairs, which, though supposed to be celestial thrones, were manifestly derived from an imperfect recollection of the sedilia in some Gothic cathedral. The deity himself presided over their deliberations. Originally the members of this council had obviously been nothing but thought forms. But at the time when Kerr inquiries brought us into contact with them, several of them had been seized and ensouled by living entities, and this ensoulment introduced some new and interesting factors. 2 of these entities were dead men, both of them religious people, each working from his own point of view. One of them was a man of German extraction, who during earth life had been a shoemaker, a simple and uninstructed man not altogether unlike the former. He too had studied the Bible diligently, he too was a dreamer of vague, mystical dreams. He too felt that he had a special revelation or interpretation to offer to the world, something far more rational than the farmer's. He had come to feel that the essential truth of Christianity lay in the mystical union of Christ and his heavenly bride, the Church. To him the Christ was far less the historical personality of the Gospels than the living spirit of the Church, and the task of the true Christian was to awaken within himself the Christ spirit. The message which humanity needed, he thought, was that every man could and should become a Christ, a message which seemed to him so clear and simple that it needed only to be delivered to command instant attention, and thus to save the world from sin and lift it at once into the light of truth. He had begun preaching to this effect while still on the physical earth, but had died before he had done much towards the conversion of humanity. Arriving in the astral world, he was still as eager as ever to spread his views, and having met the farmer he struck up a friendship with him. They had much in common, and each felt that the other might be helpful to him in the prosecution of his scheme. The shoemaker did not recognize the farmer as the sole Christ, but he did apply his theory to him, and consider him as a person in whom the Christ spirit was exceptionally developed. The farmer understood only vaguely the shoemaker's central idea, but he realized that he had found someone who was willing to cooperate in saving the world. Each regarded the other as somewhat eccentric, but still each with a simple cunning thought that he could make use of the other for his own purposes. Between them they had conceived this curious idea of a council of heaven, of which they were both members. Or possibly they may have found a thought form of this kind made by someone else, and may simply have adopted it and joined themselves to it. The thought forms as viewed by trained vision were clumsy and imperfect, though no doubt quite satisfactory to their makers. Moses, for example, was seriously incomplete. He sat, stiff and rigid, as though glued to his uncomfortable golden throne, but in reality he was only a face and front projecting from the chair, and had never been properly finished off behind. In this respect he resembled many of the thought forms found in the Summerland, where it is not infrequent to see mothers fondling children which are defective in exactly the same way. The creators of such forms are always completely happy with them and never perceive their imperfections, for though there is no life in such dolls except the thought which is put into them, that thought will always respond to its generator and do exactly what it is expected to do. Peter was another very inefficient person on this council, quite insignificant looking, but at least he carried a large bunch of keys, the jingling of which was his principal contribution to the deliberations. While the majority of this council was of the type just described, the thought forms of the deity, of Paul, the image chosen for occupation by the shoemaker, and of the prophet Elijah were much more definite and original. The latter indeed quite surprised us by his activity, and on examination it was found that he, too, was being occupied, for at least used as a kind of mouthpiece, by another dead man, a Welshman, who at some early period in his earth life had gone through the experience called conversion, and had later on emigrated to America, where he had lived for some years and eventually died. During his physical life he had always been seeking religious experiences of the emotional type, for instance, he had attended some of the Negro revival meetings, and had there witnessed and taken part in the celebrated Jerusalem jump. Intermingled with his religion were curious socialistic proclivities, and his dream was of a golden millennium which was half irrational, emotional Christianity and half materialistic socialism. He had grasped rather more than the others the relation between the physical and astral worlds, and the possibilities of the latter. And he understood that before he could hope to influence the physical world he must somehow or other get into touch with it. He was not thinking of reincarnation, for he had never heard of such an idea, but he knew that he had passed from the physical world into the astral, and therefore he thought there must be some way of passing back again. His attention was much occupied with this problem, and when he became aware that the farmer had found a medium through whom he could come to some extent into touch with the physical world, he decided to make use of both in any way that he could. This seemed a possible first step in the direction of gaining his ends. And it occurred to him to enter the thought form of Elijah in the Council of Heaven as a means of presently introducing himself on such a footing as would at once ensure respect from the others. I do not think he was in any way self-seeking or self-conceited in doing this, it was to him simply a means to an end, providentially put in his way. But now ensued an unexpected result. Masquerading thus as Elijah, he tried to bear himself as he thought the prophet would have done, and to impart an Old Testament flavor to his impersonation. This reacted upon his ordinary astral life. He began to live all the while in the character, and by degrees to wonder whether he was not really Elijah. He is literally in process of transforming himself, and will assuredly soon be a confirmed monomaniac. At the time of our investigation he still knew that he was a Welshman who occasionally impersonated Elijah. But I feel certain that in the near future he will pass beyond that stage, and will be as sure that he is really Elijah as the farmer is that he is the Christ. Meantime he had not yet introduced himself as the Welshman to the other human members of the council, but flattered himself that as Elijah he was inspiring great respect and in fact directing their decisions. We have, therefore, the astonishing spectacle of a council whose only effective members were 3 dead men, each one of whom thought that he was manipulating the others for the furtherance of his own objects. And yet none of those objects was selfish, and all the men concerned were religious, well-meaning and honest in intention. Only in the astral world would such an extraordinary combination be possible. Yet the most astounding and the most characteristic fact still remains to be told. It has been already mentioned that the All-Father himself was supposed to preside over the meetings of the council. He was of course a thought form like all the rest, but he occasionally manifested a spasmodic and inappropriate activity which showed the presence of some exterior force, different in quality from the others. Careful investigation showed that just as the form of Elijah was ensouled by the Welshman, so was this form of the deity ensouled by a frolicsome nature spirit. I have already described some of the characteristics of this delightful kingdom of nature. It may be remembered what a keen pleasure some of such creatures take in theatrical performances among themselves. In any sort of masquerade, most especially if thereby they can gain the triumph of deceiving or frightening a member of the superior human evolution, and also how they enjoy telling some enthralling tale to their fellows. Bearing this in mind, we shall at once see that, from the point of view of a tricksy nature spirit, here was an absolutely unique opportunity. He could, and did, play a joke on the most colossal scale conceivable upon 3 human beings, and we may readily imagine what a soul-satisfying story he had to tell afterwards to his admiring fellows. Needless to say, he had not the faintest idea of irreverence, he would probably be no more capable of such a conception than a fly would. To him the whole thing was nothing but an unequaled opportunity for a really gorgeous hoax, and he did his very best with it. Of course he could neither understand nor join in the deliberations, so for the most part he preserved a cryptic silence which was very effective. He had somehow acquired a small number of biblical phrases appropriate to his part, and he emptied these out upon the council at intervals as a parrot might, apparently having no conception of their meaning. Thus saith the Lord, Amen, so be it. I am the Lord thy God, thou shalt have none other gods but me, I will smite the earth with a curse. These were some of the gems of his collection, the specimens of his unconscious eloquence. Now and again the joke became too much for him, or perhaps the restraint was irksome, and he abandoned the thought form for a few moments in order to relieve his overstrained feelings by wild dancing and outbursts of laughter. Somewhere out of sight of his counsel. When this happened, it was most interesting to see how the thought form collapsed from alertness to stolidity. And the unfortunate human members of the council immediately supposed that something had occurred to provoke that divine wrath which is always so prominent a part of this type of religion. This, then, was the reality behind the awe-inspiring Council of Heaven, before which our correspondent pleaded so earnestly. It will be understood that only the dead men could really contribute to whatever discussion may have taken place. The other members of the council could not originate anything, though they may have had enough vitality to give a formal assent to a proposition. To understand the part played in the vision by the theosophical thought forms, we must glance at the history and mental condition of our correspondent. Falling away from a rather materialistic form of Christianity, she became practically an atheist. Then she lost a beloved child, and in such a nature these various experiences naturally produced deep emotions, each of which had its part in the molding of her temperament. At this period she came into contact with theosophy, and commenced its study with no less formidable a book than the Secret Doctrine. Undaunted by its difficulties, she applied herself to it diligently and strove to grasp its teaching, to make mental pictures of what is described in the stanzas of Zion. Certain of its ideas had a special attraction for her. The thought of initiation with its mysterious and dangerous ordeals was one of them. Another was the succession of the races, coupled with the great question as to who shall and who shall not pass the final test and reach in safety the further shore. All this was inevitably to some extent colored by earlier Christian conceptions about conversion and salvation, even though at the same time the splendid horizons of the great Oriental religions opened before her. Thus it came about that she surrounded herself with a great mass of strong thought forms of a more or less theosophical character, and by the very fact of doing so unconsciously set in motion certain occult laws. In the higher worlds, like attracts like, and her thought forms soon drew to themselves others of similar nature. Some hundreds of miles from where she lived there was an earnest theosophical lodge, which among other activities maintained a secret doctrine class. A vast mass of thought forms and speculations had been thrown off by this class, and our correspondent was soon in touch with this astral storehouse. How the first contact was made I did not observe. Perhaps when traveling in the astral body our correspondent may have been attracted by the presentations of subject in which she was so deeply interested. Or on the other hand some member of the class may have astrally noticed her thoughts and tried to add to them, or it may have been simply that sympathetic vibrations attracted one another, as they invariably do, without human interference. However that may have been, the fact remains that she was surrounded by an enormous body of thought forms of a particular type, she herself being at the very same time precisely in the condition to be most deeply affected by them. At this period she began to practice breathing exercises, and by that means laid herself open to astral influences. Her keen sympathy with suffering caused her to seek the dead murderer, or perhaps brought him to her, and the automatic writing and the obsession followed in the natural course of events. The murderer put forth all his power to maintain the advantage which he had gained, and she struggled desperately to protect and free herself. Making herself for the time quite a conspicuous object in the astral world by the vehemence of her efforts and the amount of energy which she put forth. As the farmer wandered about, the affray attracted his attention, and in his character as the Christ he felt it his duty to interfere and expel the murderer. He had never before encountered so brilliant an astral body. Nor had he seen such impressive surrounding as those of the person whom he had rescued, a mass of forms at once so unusual in type, connected as it was with cosmic processes considered from the Oriental point of view, and at the same time so far larger in quantity than any one person normally carries with him. Here were the forms of Oriental gods, of the founders of religions, of masters, adepts, angels, and all sorts of magnificent but unfamiliar conceptions. If we remember that the farmer could not know that these were only thought forms, but must inevitably have taken them as actual living beings, we shall see that it is small wonder that with his ignorance on all such matters and his constant expectation of celestial assistance in his appointed work, He should feel that he had been specially guided by Providence to help one who could help him in return, a person of importance in the Oriental world commensurate with that which he arrogated to himself for the Occident. At once he seized his opportunity, he proclaimed himself as the appointed guide and proceeded to take charge of the lady's further development. A curious fact noticed here was that, though he posed as guide, he was largely influenced by the thoughts of our correspondent, and in many cases simply gave her back those thoughts in other language. He knew nothing of the serpent fire, but he thought of it as some form of divine afflatus. He saw that some process of awakening was being performed by its aid, and he did his best to help and encourage this. Their joint efforts succeeded in arousing what may be called the upper layers of that mysterious force, though fortunately for the lady, from ignorance as to what is really needed for full achievement, they were not able to stir it to its depths. Otherwise her body would surely have been destroyed. Further, they evidently did not know through what centers it must be sent in order to bring continuous consciousness, and so they missed their aim. But the description given of the sufferings endured is accurate as far as it goes, and some of the expressions used are strikingly suggestive. How dangerous their experiments were may be seen from the lady's account of these sufferings, and from her family's testimony as to the condition in which she had been. The whole story gives a most impressive warning against the risk of attempting premature development along such lines. It is useless to criticize in detail what may be called the theosophical part of the vision. Wonderful, uplifting, awe-inspiring as it no doubt was to the seer, it after all represents not the actual occurrences of evolution, but the combination and synthesis of a number of thought images. Parts of the symbology are interesting and illuminative, while others obviously require modification. Certain features, such as the chanting of the angels, are clearly due to the influence of the Christian stream of thought in the mind of the guide. He watched the unfolding of the vision along with our correspondent, but being ignorant of Oriental teaching he understood but little of it. For example, he seemed